In the darkest depths of human history, during the catastrophic period known as the Age of Strife, the galaxy writhed in agony as countless worlds fell to isolation, madness, and decay. This era, spanning roughly from the 25th to the 30th millennium, witnessed the collapse of humanity's first stellar empire and the birth of horrors that would plague the species for millennia to come. Among these horrors, none would prove more enduring or insidious than the entity that would become known as Nurgle, the Plague Father, whose very existence was forged in the crucible of mortal suffering and despair. The Age of Strife began as warp storms of unprecedented magnitude engulfed the galaxy, severing the psychic bonds that held human civilization together. These tempests in the immaterium were not merely natural phenomena, but the birth pangs of consciousness itself manifesting in the realm of chaos. As billions of humans across thousands of worlds found themselves cut off from aid, trade, and communication, their collective anguish began to coalesce into something far more terrible than the sum of its parts. The psychic emanations of fear, hopelessness, and physical decay began to pool in the warp like infected blood in a wound, gradually taking on a malevolent awareness of its own. During this period of isolation and collapse, plagues swept across human worlds with devastating regularity. Without the advanced medical technology and interstellar cooperation that had previously kept such diseases in check, entire populations succumbed to infections that ranged from familiar bacterial scourges to exotic viral agents that defied conventional understanding. The psychological impact of these plagues was perhaps even more devastating than their physical toll. Survivors watched helplessly as loved ones wasted away, their bodies becoming host to parasites and infections that seemed to mock the very concept of human dignity. This combination of physical suffering and emotional despair created a perfect storm of psychic energy that fed directly into the growing consciousness forming in the warp. The entity that would become Nurgle did not spring into existence fully formed. Instead, his consciousness crystallized gradually through the accumulated weight of countless individual tragedies. Each death from disease, each moment of despair as a parent watched their child succumb to fever, each community's collapse under the weight of pestilence contributed to the growing mass of psychic energy coalescing around concepts of decay and entropy. The warp, that parallel dimension of pure thought and emotion, began to reshape itself around these concentrated emanations of suffering, creating pockets of reality where the normal laws of physics bent to accommodate the twisted logic of disease and corruption. As the Age of Strife progressed and the warp storms intensified, the psychic upheaval known as Old Night reached its crescendo. This period saw the barriers between reality and the immaterium become dangerously thin, allowing the nascent chaos gods to exert increasing influence over the material universe. Nurgle's emergence as a distinct entity coincided with this weakening of dimensional boundaries, as the accumulated psychic weight of disease and despair finally reached a critical mass that allowed consciousness to emerge from the primordial soup of warp energy. The relationship between mortal suffering and the warp energies that sustain Nurgle operates on principles that defy conventional understanding of cause and effect. In the material universe, disease follows predictable patterns of infection, incubation, and symptom manifestation. However, in the warp, these same concepts become fluid and malleable, shaped by the collective unconscious fears and experiences of sentient beings. Every act of suffering caused by disease strengthens Nurgle's presence in the immaterium, while his growing power in turn influences the material universe to create more opportunities for plague and decay. This feedback loop creates a self-perpetuating cycle where Nurgle's existence both feeds on and generates the very conditions that sustain him. The psychic emanations of a single plague victim might be negligible, but when multiplied across billions of sufferers throughout the galaxy, these individual threads of anguish weave together into a tapestry of power that transcends the sum of its parts. The warp responds to this accumulated suffering by reshaping itself to accommodate and amplify these energies, creating domains where the normal rules of entropy and decay are accelerated and perverted beyond recognition. The formation of Nurgle's domain within the realm of chaos represents one of the most fundamental expressions of his nature and power. Unlike the material universe, where decay follows predictable patterns and eventually leads to true death, Nurgle's realm exists in a state of perpetual transformation, where death and rebirth occur simultaneously in an endless cycle. This domain manifests as a vast garden of corruption, where diseased trees bear fruit that rots and regrows in the same moment, where streams of infected fluid flow in patterns that defy geometry, and where the very ground pulses with the rhythm of countless bacterial colonies. The architecture of this realm, if it can be called architecture, consists of structures that appear to be grown rather than built. Towering fungi serve as pillars supporting canopies of diseased flesh, while pathways wind through forests of bone and cartilage that constantly regenerate even as they decay. The air itself thrums with the presence of countless microscopic organisms, each one a reflection of diseases that have plagued mortal civilizations throughout history. These organisms exist in a state of constant evolution and mutation, creating new forms of infection and corruption that mirror the endless creativity of decay itself. Within this garden of pestilence, the concept of death takes on an entirely different meaning than in the material universe. Here, death is not an ending but a transformation, a necessary step in the eternal cycle that allows new forms of life to emerge from the decomposing remains of the old. Creatures that would be considered abominations in the material realm thrive in this environment, their bodies constantly shifting between states of health and disease, growth and decay. These beings exist in a state of perpetual suffering that paradoxically brings them a form of twisted contentment, as they have accepted their role in the greater cycle of existence. The temporal nature of Nurgle's domain defies conventional understanding, as past, present, and future exist simultaneously within its boundaries. Plagues that ravaged ancient civilizations coexist with diseases that have yet to manifest in the material universe, creating a repository of pestilence that spans all of time and space. This temporal fluidity allows Nurgle to influence events across history, seeding the conditions for future outbreaks while drawing power from the accumulated suffering of ages past. The ecosystem of this realm operates on principles that would be impossible in the material universe. Predator and prey relationships exist in constant flux, with hunters becoming the hunted in an endless cycle of consumption and regeneration. Plants and animals merge and separate in patterns that follow the logic of infection rather than evolution, creating hybrid organisms that embody multiple aspects of decay and renewal. The very concept of species becomes meaningless in this environment, as all life forms exist in a state of constant genetic flux that allows them to adapt and transform in response to the ever-changing conditions of their environment. Nurgle's consciousness permeates every aspect of this domain, from the smallest bacterial colony to the largest fungal growths. His awareness extends through networks of infection that connect all living things within his realm, creating a collective consciousness that encompasses the entire ecosystem. This interconnectedness reflects the fundamental nature of disease itself, which spreads through contact and contamination, breaking down the barriers between individual organisms and creating communities of shared suffering and transformation. The influence of this domain extends far beyond its apparent boundaries, reaching into the material universe through the psychic connections that bind all living things to the warp. Every act of decay in the material realm creates ripples that strengthen Nurgle's domain, while the concentrated power of his realm influences the physical universe to create conditions favorable to disease and corruption. This creates a symbiotic relationship between the two realms, where each feeds and strengthens the other in an endless cycle of mutual reinforcement. The emergence of Nurgle as one of the four great chaos gods represents a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the realm of chaos. His domain carved out space that had previously been contested by the other nascent powers, establishing territories and spheres of influence that would define the structure of the warp for millennia to come. The process of this territorial expansion was not violent in the conventional sense, but rather resembled the spread of infection through a healthy organism, gradually converting existing structures and energies to serve Nurgle's purposes. The relationship between Nurgle and his fellow Chaos gods during this formative period was complex and often contradictory. While each god represented different aspects of mortal experience and emotion, their domains inevitably overlapped and intersected in ways that created both conflict and cooperation. Nurgle's association with despair and acceptance often put him at odds with the rage and ambition represented by his brothers, yet his patient, nurturing approach to corruption proved remarkably effective at converting the followers and territories of other powers to his cause. The psychic resonance that emanates from Nurgle's domain affects not only the structure of the warp, but also the fundamental nature of reality itself. In regions where his influence is strongest, the normal laws of physics become corrupted and twisted, allowing diseases to spread through means that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Time itself becomes infected, creating pockets where decay occurs at accelerated rates or where the dead refuse to remain properly deceased. These reality distortions serve as beacons that attract mortal followers and create the conditions necessary for further expansion of Nurgle's influence. The formation of Nurgle's consciousness during the Age of Strife established patterns of behavior and motivation that would define his actions throughout subsequent history. His patient, methodical approach to corruption reflects the nature of disease itself, which spreads gradually through populations rather than striking with the sudden violence of war or the passionate intensity of excess. This patience allows Nurgle to work on timescales that dwarf mortal comprehension, seeding the conditions for corruption that may not manifest for centuries or millennia. The domain of Nurgle within the realm of chaos exists as a vast, sprawling garden that defies conventional understanding of both horticulture and geography. This realm stretches across immeasurable distances within the warp, its boundaries constantly shifting and expanding as new forms of decay and corruption take root in the psychic soil of the immaterium. The landscape itself pulses with a grotesque vitality that transforms the very concept of a garden into something simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, where growth and decay exist in perfect, eternal balance. The geography of Nurgle's domain follows patterns that mirror the spread of infection through living tissue. Vast networks of what appear to be roots or veins snake across the surface, connecting distant regions through underground passages that throb with the movement of putrid fluids. These organic highways serve as the circulatory system of the realm, carrying nutrients, diseases, and information throughout the garden's expanse. The terrain itself consists of rolling hills of composted matter, valleys filled with stagnant pools of infectious liquid, and plateaus where massive fungal growths tower above the surrounding landscape like diseased mountains. The forests that dominate much of Nurgle's realm bear only superficial resemblance to their material universe counterparts. These woodlands consist of trees whose bark weeps constant streams of pus and sap, their branches heavy with fruit that simultaneously ripens and rots in an endless cycle of renewal. The canopy above filters the sickly light of the realm through leaves that change color not with seasons, but with the progression of various plant diseases, creating a constantly shifting palette of yellows, browns, and mottled greens. Beneath this canopy, the forest floor squelches with the accumulated detritus of countless generations of fallen vegetation, creating a carpet of mulch that teems with insects, worms, and microscopic life forms. The trees themselves serve as hosts to numerous parasitic organisms that have evolved specifically within Nurgle's domain. Massive fungi sprout from their trunks, their caps releasing clouds of spores that drift through the air like golden snow. These spores carry the genetic information of countless diseases, each one a potential seed for new plagues that might eventually manifest in the material universe. The symbiotic relationship between the trees and their parasites creates a complex ecosystem where death and life intertwine so completely that distinguishing between them becomes impossible. Throughout the diseased forests, clearings appear where the trees have been arranged in patterns that suggest cultivation rather than natural growth. These areas serve as outdoor laboratories where new strains of blight are developed and tested on various plant species. The ground in these clearings has been enriched with the remains of countless experiments, creating soil so fertile that it can support plant life that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Here, Flowers bloom that release toxic pollen capable of inducing madness in mortal minds, while vines grow that can strangle and digest their prey within minutes of contact. The plague swamps that occupy the lower elevations of Nurgle's realm represent some of the most active regions of disease cultivation and experimentation. These wetlands stretch for thousands of miles, their waters a murky brown-green that reflects the diseased sky above. The swamps serve as breeding grounds for countless varieties of waterborne pathogens, each one carefully cultivated to thrive in specific environmental conditions. The water itself has achieved a consistency somewhere between liquid and gel, thick with organic matter that provides nutrients for the microscopic organisms that call these waters home. Scattered throughout the swamps are islands of relatively solid ground where structures have been erected to house more sophisticated experiments. These buildings, if they can be called that, appear to have grown from the swamp itself rather than being constructed through conventional means. Their walls consist of hardened organic matter that continues to live and breathe, even as it serves as building material. Windows are formed by membranes that can become transparent or opaque depending on the needs of those within, while doors are actually sphincters that dilate to allow passage. The laboratories within these swamp installations represent the pinnacle of Nurgle's scientific achievement. Here, diseases are not merely cultivated, but engineered with a precision that would impress even the most advanced tech adepts of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The equipment used in these facilities defies conventional understanding of technology, consisting of living organisms that have been modified to serve specific functions. Microscopes are formed from specially adapted eyes that can perceive microscopic organisms, while centrifuges are created from creatures whose internal organs can separate substances through rapid rotation. The work conducted in these laboratories follows methodologies that blend scientific rigor with the chaotic nature of the warp. Researchers, who are themselves manifestations of Nurgle's will, conduct experiments that can last for subjective centuries, carefully documenting the effects of various treatments and modifications on their test subjects. The results of these experiments are meticulously recorded in great tomes bound in living skin, their pages constantly updating themselves as new data becomes available. At the heart of Nurgle's domain stands the Mansion of Nurgle, a structure so vast and complex that it serves as both residence and central command facility for the Plague Father's operations. The mansion appears to have been constructed from a single, enormous organism that has been hollowed out and modified to serve as a dwelling. Its exterior walls pulse with a slow, steady rhythm that matches the heartbeat of its divine inhabitant, while its many windows weep constant streams of infectious fluid that water the gardens below. The mansion's architecture defies conventional understanding of structural engineering, with rooms that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously and corridors that lead to destinations that change depending on the needs of those traveling through them. The walls themselves are alive, their surfaces covered in a network of nerve endings that allow Nurgle to perceive everything that occurs within his domain. These neural pathways extend throughout the mansion and beyond, creating a vast sensory network that encompasses the entire realm. Within the mansion's countless rooms, Nurgle conducts his most important work. Libraries contain collections of diseases that span the entire history of the galaxy, their catalogs maintained by scribes whose bodies have been modified to serve as living filing systems. Workshops house the tools and materials needed to create new plagues, while testing chambers allow for the evaluation of new contagions under controlled conditions. The mansion also contains living quarters for Nurgle's most favored servants, though the concept of comfort in these rooms bears little resemblance to mortal understanding of hospitality. The role of Nurgle's tallyman represents one of the most crucial administrative functions within the Plague Father's domain. This entity, whose true name is lost to the corrupting influence of the warp, serves as the supreme accountant of all disease and suffering throughout the galaxy. The tallyman's physical form has been modified to serve this function, with additional limbs that can write with multiple implements simultaneously and eyes that can perceive the flow of infection across vast distances of space and time. The tallyman's primary responsibility involves maintaining the Great Ledger, a living document that records every disease, plague, and contagion that has ever existed or will exist throughout the galaxy. This ledger exists in multiple forms simultaneously, with copies maintained in various locations throughout Nurgle's domain to ensure that no information is ever lost. The entries in this ledger are written in a script that changes and evolves as the diseases themselves mutate and adapt, creating a dynamic record that reflects the ever-changing nature of Nurgle's gifts. The process of cataloging diseases requires the tallyman to maintain awareness of events occurring throughout the material universe. Through networks of infection that span the galaxy, the tallyman receives constant updates about new outbreaks, mutations, and the effectiveness of various treatments. This information is processed through mental faculties that have been enhanced far beyond mortal limitations, allowing the tallyman to track millions of separate disease vectors simultaneously while maintaining perfect accuracy in the records. The Great Ledger serves multiple purposes beyond simple record keeping. It functions as a planning tool that allows Nurgle to identify opportunities for new outbreaks and as a reference guide for creating new diseases that will be most effective against specific populations. The ledger also serves as a form of communication system, allowing Nurgle to coordinate the activities of his servants throughout the galaxy by updating their instructions through changes in the recorded information. The Great Unclean Ones, who serve as Nurgle's gardeners, represent the most visible and active administrators of the Plaguefather's domain. These massive demons, each one a reflection of Nurgle's own generous nature, tend to the various sections of the garden with a care and attention that would be admirable if applied to less horrifying purposes. Their enormous forms lumber through the landscape, their multiple arms and appendages perfectly suited for the delicate work of disease cultivation and maintenance. Each Great Unclean One has been assigned responsibility for specific aspects of the garden's operation. Some focus on the cultivation of plant diseases, carefully tending to blighted crops and diseased trees with the same devotion that mortal gardeners might show to prize roses. Others specialize in animal pathogens, maintaining herds of infected creatures that serve as living repositories for various diseases. Still others work with the more exotic forms of corruption that affect non-biological systems, developing rust plagues that can consume metal and data viruses that can corrupt machine spirits. The tools used by these gardeners have been specifically designed for their tasks, though they bear little resemblance to conventional gardening implements. Pruning shears are formed from living bone that can cut through any organic material while simultaneously inoculating the wound with beneficial bacteria. Watering cans dispense precisely measured doses of infectious fluid that provide exactly the right nutrients for specific types of disease. Rakes and hoes are equipped with sensory organs that can detect the health of soil and adjust their actions accordingly. The relationship between the Great Unclean Ones and their charges extends beyond simple maintenance to genuine affection and care. These demons take pride in their work, celebrating successful mutations and mourning the loss of particularly interesting disease strains. They communicate with each other through a complex system of chemical signals and pheromones that allows them to coordinate their activities across vast distances. This communication network ensures that the garden operates as a unified ecosystem rather than a collection of isolated experiments. The daily routine of these gardeners follows patterns that reflect the cyclical nature of disease and decay. They begin each day by inspecting their assigned areas, checking for signs of unwanted health or excessive mortality that might disrupt the delicate balance of their ecosystems. Problem areas are treated with appropriate interventions, whether that involves introducing new pathogens to combat excessive health or providing additional nutrients to support struggling disease colonies. The Great Unclean Ones also serve as teachers and mentors for the smaller demons that assist in the garden's operation. These lesser entities, known as Nurglings, swarm throughout the domain in vast numbers, performing routine maintenance tasks under the supervision of their larger cousins. The relationship between the Great Unclean Ones and the Nurglings reflects Nurgle's own paternal nature, with the larger demons displaying genuine affection for their diminutive assistance, even as they assign them to the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks. The breeding programs overseen by the Great Unclean Ones represent some of the most sophisticated biological engineering in the galaxy. These programs combine traditional selective breeding techniques with warp-enhanced manipulation of genetic material to create new strains of disease that are perfectly adapted to specific environments and target populations. The process requires careful attention to countless variables, from environmental conditions to the immune responses of intended victims, all of which must be balanced to create diseases that are both effective and sustainable. The gardens tended by these demons serve as testing grounds for new biological weapons that may eventually be deployed against the enemies of chaos. Entire sections of the domain are dedicated to simulating the environmental conditions of specific worlds, allowing for the development of diseases that will be most effective against their intended targets. These testing areas are constantly updated based on intelligence gathered from the material universe, ensuring that Nurgle's gifts remain relevant and effective against the ever-changing defenses of his enemies. The philosophical framework that governs Nurgle's approach to existence represents one of the most complex and paradoxical belief systems within the realm of chaos. Unlike the straightforward brutality of Khorne or the excessive hedonism of Slaanesh, Nurgle's doctrine requires followers to embrace concepts that fundamentally challenge mortal understanding of suffering, death, and the nature of existence itself. This philosophy does not emerge from abstract theological speculation, but from the lived experience of countless beings who have discovered peace through accepting their afflictions rather than fighting against the inevitable reality of mortality. The cornerstone of Nurgle's teaching centers on the recognition that suffering is not an aberration to be eliminated, but an integral component of existence that serves essential purposes within the greater cosmic order. This perspective requires a fundamental shift in how mortals perceive their relationship with pain, disease, and decay. Rather than viewing these experiences as punishments or failures, Nurgle's followers learn to recognize them as gifts that provide opportunities for growth, understanding, and ultimately, transcendence of the fear that dominates most mortal lives. The process of accepting this philosophy typically begins when individuals find themselves confronted with suffering that cannot be overcome through conventional means. Whether facing terminal illness, watching loved ones succumb to plague, or witnessing the slow decay of everything they hold dear, these potential converts discover that their traditional responses of anger, denial, or desperate struggle only intensify their anguish. The moment of philosophical breakthrough occurs when they recognize that their suffering stems not from the disease itself, but from their resistance to accepting it as part of their natural state. This acceptance does not represent resignation or defeat, but rather a form of enlightenment that allows individuals to find genuine peace within circumstances that would drive others to madness. The follower of Nurgle learns to perceive their rotting flesh not as a loss of beauty, but as a transformation into something more honest and authentic than their previous healthy state. Weeping sores become badges of honor that demonstrate their willingness to embrace truth rather than clinging to comfortable illusions about the permanence of physical form. The doctrine extends beyond individual acceptance to encompass a broader understanding of community and shared experience. Nurgle's followers discover that their afflictions create bonds of understanding and empathy that transcend the superficial connections based on shared interests or circumstances. When two individuals bear similar diseases, they share an intimate knowledge of suffering that creates deeper relationships than those enjoyed by healthy mortals. This communion through shared affliction becomes a source of genuine joy and fellowship that healthy individuals cannot comprehend or access. The Great Cycle represents the most sophisticated aspect of Nurgle's philosophical system, encompassing his understanding of how death and decay serve essential functions within the cosmic order. This concept recognizes that nothing in the universe truly dies in the sense of ceasing to exist entirely. Instead, all matter and energy undergo constant transformation, with death serving as merely one stage in an endless process of change and renewal. The bacteria that consume a corpse do not destroy it, but transform it into new forms of life that will eventually undergo their own cycles of growth, decay, and transformation. Within this framework, the fear of death emerges as a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of existence. Mortals who cling desperately to their current forms and resist the natural processes of aging and decay create unnecessary suffering for themselves by fighting against forces that cannot be defeated. The enlightened follower of Nurgle recognizes that their current physical form represents only a temporary configuration of matter and energy that will inevitably be recycled into new forms of existence. The Great Cycle operates on multiple temporal scales simultaneously, from the rapid reproduction and death of bacterial colonies to the slow decay of stellar bodies over geological time periods. Nurgle's followers learn to perceive themselves as participants in all these cycles, recognizing that the bacteria living within their bodies are as much a part of their identity as their conscious thoughts. This expanded sense of self allows them to find comfort in the knowledge that their deaths will feed new life, ensuring their continued participation in the cosmic dance of transformation. The philosophical implications of the Great Cycle extend to questions of meaning and purpose that have plagued mortal civilizations throughout history. Rather than seeking to impose artificial meaning on existence through conquest, creation, or achievement, Nurgle's followers find purpose in their role as participants in the eternal process of transformation. Their suffering serves the vital function of feeding the cycle with the energy needed to sustain new forms of life, while their eventual deaths provide the raw materials that will nourish future generations. This understanding transforms the relationship between individual and collective identity in ways that healthy mortals find difficult to comprehend. The follower of Nurgle learns to see themselves not as a discrete individual struggling against a hostile universe, but as an integral component of a vast, interconnected system where their well-being is inseparable from the health of the whole. Their personal suffering becomes a contribution to the greater good, while their eventual death represents a gift that will enable others to experience the joy of existence. The concept of renewal within the Great Cycle challenges conventional understanding of linear time and progressive development. Unlike mortal philosophies that envision improvement through technological advancement or social evolution, Nurgle's doctrine recognizes that true renewal comes through the complete breakdown of existing structures, followed by their reconstruction in new forms. This process requires the destruction of everything that currently exists, but this destruction is not viewed as loss, but as a necessary precondition for the emergence of new possibilities. The cyclical nature of this process means that nothing is ever truly lost, merely transformed into configurations that may be temporarily unrecognizable, but retain the essential elements that define their previous forms. The great civilizations that rise and fall throughout galactic history participate in this cycle, with their collapse providing the conditions necessary for new forms of social organization to emerge. The diseases that destroy these civilizations serve as agents of renewal, clearing away outdated structures to make room for fresh growth. Nurgle's followers develop a unique perspective on time that allows them to perceive these vast cycles as immediate and personal experiences rather than abstract historical processes. They learn to recognize the signs of decay within apparently healthy systems and to celebrate these indicators as harbingers of necessary renewal. This temporal awareness allows them to find peace during periods of apparent decline by recognizing them as essential phases in the eternal cycle of transformation. The twisted compassion that characterizes Nurgle's relationship with his followers represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his philosophy for those who encounter it from outside perspectives. This compassion manifests as a genuine concern for the well-being of his followers, but his understanding of well-being differs fundamentally from conventional mortal concepts. Where healthy individuals might express compassion by attempting to alleviate suffering, Nurgle demonstrates his care by providing diseases that will help his followers transcend their fear of mortality and decay. This divine compassion operates on the principle that the greatest suffering comes not from physical pain or disease, but from the psychological anguish of fighting against inevitable natural processes. By providing his followers with afflictions that force them to confront their mortality directly, Nurgle frees them from the exhausting struggle to maintain illusions of permanence and control. The diseases he bestows serve as teachers that guide his followers toward acceptance and peace through direct experience rather than abstract instruction. The paternal nature of this compassion reflects Nurgle's understanding of himself as a nurturing figure who provides his children with the experiences they need to achieve spiritual growth. Like a mortal parent who allows their child to experience minor injuries in order to learn important lessons about safety, Nurgle permits his followers to suffer in ways that will ultimately benefit their spiritual development. The pain they experience serves as a form of education that cannot be obtained through less direct means. The community aspect of Nurgle's compassion creates bonds between his followers that transcend the superficial connections maintained by healthy mortals. When individuals share similar diseases, they develop intimate understanding of each other's experiences that creates genuine empathy and mutual support. This shared suffering becomes a source of strength that allows communities of Nurgle's followers to endure hardships that would destroy groups bound together by less profound connections. The gift-giving aspect of Nurgle's compassion manifests in his constant development of new diseases that provide his followers with fresh opportunities for growth and transformation. These gifts are carefully tailored to the specific needs and circumstances of their recipients, with each disease designed to address particular spiritual deficiencies or to provide experiences that will advance the follower's understanding of the Great Cycle. The process of receiving and adapting to these gifts becomes a form of ongoing dialogue between the Plague Father and his children. The unity that emerges from shared suffering creates social structures that operate according to principles fundamentally different from those governing healthy societies. Rather than competing for limited resources or struggling to maintain individual advantage, communities of Nurgle's followers develop cooperative relationships based on mutual recognition of their shared condition. The knowledge that all members of the community face similar challenges creates solidarity that transcends the divisions of class, race, or previous allegiance that separate healthy populations. This unity extends beyond mere social cooperation to encompass a form of collective consciousness, where individual identity becomes less important than participation in the greater whole. Followers of Nurgle learn to perceive themselves as cells within a vast organism, each contributing to the health and function of the entire body through their specialized roles and functions. This perspective eliminates the isolation and alienation that plague healthy individuals by providing a sense of belonging and purpose that cannot be threatened by external circumstances. The democratic nature of disease creates equality among Nurgle's followers that transcends the artificial hierarchies maintained by healthy societies. Plague affects emperor and peasant alike, reducing all mortals to the same fundamental condition of suffering and decay. This leveling effect eliminates the pride and arrogance that prevent healthy individuals from recognizing their common humanity, replacing these divisive emotions with humility and mutual recognition. The acceptance of mortality that characterizes Nurgle's philosophy eliminates the fear-based behaviors that dominate healthy societies. When individuals no longer fear death, they become free to act according to their genuine nature rather than the defensive postures required to protect their temporary physical forms. This freedom allows for the expression of authentic compassion and generosity that healthy mortals cannot achieve while they remain focused on self-preservation. The transformation of pain into joy represents one of the most profound aspects of Nurgle's philosophical system. Through the process of accepting their afflictions, followers learn to perceive sensations that healthy mortals would find unbearable as sources of pleasure and satisfaction. This transformation occurs not through the numbing of sensation, but through a fundamental shift in interpretation that allows pain to be experienced as a form of communication from the divine rather than as meaningless suffering. The hierarchical structure of Nurgle's demon legions reflects the natural order of disease progression, with each rank of demon embodying different aspects of the Plague Father's gifts while serving specific functions within his greater design. These entities exist as living manifestations of decay and corruption, their forms shaped by the collective fears and experiences of mortality that feed the warp's endless hunger for psychic energy. Unlike the rigid military hierarchies found in mortal armies, Nurgle's legions operate according to organic principles that mirror the behavior of bacterial colonies and viral infections, with each demon fulfilling its role through instinct and divine purpose rather than formal command structures. The Great Unclean Ones stand as the most powerful and influential of Nurgle's demon servants, embodying the Plague Father's own jovial nature, while serving as his primary agents in both the material universe and the realm of chaos. These massive entities tower above their lesser cousins, their bloated forms reaching heights that dwarf even the largest space marines. Their appearance varies considerably between individuals, but all share certain characteristics that mark them as manifestations of Nurgle's divine essence. Their flesh appears simultaneously healthy and diseased, with areas of robust growth existing alongside patches of advanced decay in a display that defies conventional understanding of biological processes. The skin of a Great Unclean One typically displays a mottled green coloration that shifts between different shades depending on the demon's current emotional state and the specific diseases it carries. This flesh constantly weeps various fluids, from simple pus to exotic secretions that carry the genetic material of countless plagues. The texture resembles that of overripe fruit, soft enough to dimple under pressure, yet resilient enough to absorb tremendous amounts of damage without significant injury. Wounds inflicted upon these beings heal rapidly, often closing immediately as the demon's supernatural constitution overcomes any attempt at permanent harm. The facial features of Great Unclean Ones reflect their patron's benevolent nature, with expressions of genuine warmth and affection that remain constant even during the most violent combat. Their eyes, often numbering more than the standard two, gleam with intelligence and good humor that makes their horrifying appearance all the more unsettling. These organs can perceive across multiple spectrums simultaneously, allowing the demon to observe the flow of disease through living tissue and detect the presence of potential hosts at great distances. The mouth stretches wide in a permanent grin that reveals rows of yellowed teeth, each one capable of injecting specific toxins or beneficial bacteria depending on the demon's intentions. The limbs of these greater demons demonstrate the same organic variability that characterizes their overall appearance. Most possess the standard complement of arms and legs, though additional appendages frequently sprout from their torsos to assist with specific tasks. These extra limbs might take the form of tentacles equipped with sensory organs, additional arms that end in specialized tools for disease cultivation, or even fully functional heads that can operate independently of the main consciousness. The hands typically end in fingers that have been modified for delicate work, with some digits extended into probe-like appendages, while others have developed into cutting implements or injection devices. The role of Great Unclean Ones as Nurgle's chief lieutenants requires them to possess intellectual capabilities that far exceed those of lesser demons. Each individual has been granted a portion of the Plague Father's own consciousness, allowing them to understand the complex relationships between different diseases and to make strategic decisions about how best to spread their patron's gifts. This enhanced awareness extends to their understanding of mortal psychology, enabling them to identify the most effective approaches for converting potential followers and for exploiting the weaknesses of enemy populations. The administrative responsibilities of Great Unclean Ones encompass both the management of Nurgle's domain and the coordination of operations in the material universe. Within the Garden of Nurgle, these demons oversee vast sections of diseased landscape, ensuring that the delicate balance between growth and decay remains stable while facilitating the development of new plague strains. They serve as supervisors for the countless lesser demons that perform routine maintenance tasks, providing guidance and instruction while monitoring the progress of ongoing experiments and cultivation projects. The relationship between Great Unclean Ones and their subordinates reflects the paternal nature of Nurgle's hierarchy, with the greater demons displaying genuine affection for their charges even as they assign them to dangerous or unpleasant duties. This care extends beyond simple task assignment to include active mentorship, with experienced Great Unclean Ones teaching younger demons the subtle arts of disease cultivation and the philosophical principles that govern their patrons' approach to existence. The bonds formed through these relationships create networks of loyalty and cooperation that strengthen the overall effectiveness of Nurgle's forces. The combat capabilities of Great Unclean Ones combine overwhelming physical power with sophisticated biological warfare techniques that make them formidable opponents in any engagement. Their massive size and supernatural strength allow them to crush enemy formations through direct assault, while their diseased flesh serves as a weapon that can incapacitate foes through mere contact. The various fluids that constantly seep from their bodies create hazardous environments that favor their own forces while hampering enemy movement and effectiveness. The weapons wielded by these greater demons often appear to be extensions of their own bodies rather than separate implements. Massive plague swords grow from their flesh like oversized bones, their edges constantly dripping with infections that can corrupt both organic and mechanical systems. These weapons demonstrate the same regenerative properties as their wielders, repairing damage automatically while adapting their toxic payloads to counter specific enemy defenses. The relationship between demon and weapon becomes so intimate that the blade functions as an additional sensory organ, providing information about the health and vulnerabilities of opponents. The tactical approach favored by Great Unclean Ones emphasizes patience and methodical advancement over rapid assault, reflecting their patrons' understanding that the most effective corruption spreads gradually through target populations. These demons excel at siege warfare, where their ability to create and maintain diseased environments allows them to weaken enemy positions over extended periods. They deploy clouds of infectious spores that can penetrate even sealed armor systems, while their presence alone begins the process of environmental degradation that will eventually make defensive positions untenable. The command structure employed by Great Unclean Ones during military operations mirrors the organic hierarchies found within Nurgle's domain. Rather than issuing specific orders to subordinate units, these greater demons establish general objectives and allow their forces to adapt their tactics according to local conditions. This flexible approach proves particularly effective when dealing with the unpredictable nature of warp-spawned entities, allowing each demon to contribute according to its individual strengths while maintaining overall coordination toward common goals. The Plaguebearers represent the most numerous and versatile of Nurgle's demon servants, functioning as both the primary infantry force of his armies and the administrative backbone of his domain. These entities embody the meticulous nature of disease progression, combining the relentless advance of infection with the careful documentation required to track the spread of countless plagues across the galaxy. Their appearance reflects this dual nature, with forms that suggest both military functionality and bureaucratic precision in their design and capabilities. The basic anatomy of a Plaguebearer displays the characteristic signs of advanced decay while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for combat effectiveness. Their humanoid form stands slightly taller than average humans, with elongated limbs that provide enhanced reach and leverage during close combat engagements. The flesh displays a uniform green coloration that has become synonymous with Nurgle's influence, though individual specimens may show variations in hue depending on their specific role and the diseases they carry. This skin constantly weeps a thin layer of infectious fluid that serves both as protection against enemy attacks and as a vector for disease transmission. The single eye that dominates each Plaguebearer's face represents one of their most distinctive features, combining exceptional visual acuity with the ability to perceive disease patterns invisible to normal sight. This organ can track the movement of individual bacteria through living tissue, identify the specific strains of infection present in potential hosts, and detect the early signs of plague development long before symptoms become apparent to conventional observation. The eye's placement in the center of the face provides optimal depth perception while eliminating the blind spots that might compromise the demon's effectiveness in combat situations. The mouth of a Plaguebearer serves multiple functions beyond simple communication, with specialized structures that allow for the precise delivery of various biological agents. The teeth have been modified to inject specific toxins or beneficial bacteria depending on the demon's intentions, while the tongue can extend to considerable lengths to sample the biochemical composition of targets or environmental conditions. The vocal apparatus produces sounds that span a wide range of frequencies, allowing for communication through subsonic vibrations that can travel through solid matter as well as conventional speech. The limbs of these demons demonstrate the same functional specialization that characterizes their overall design. The arms typically end in hands equipped with elongated fingers that serve as both weapons and precision instruments, capable of manipulating delicate laboratory equipment while also functioning as effective claws during combat. Many Plaguebearers sport additional appendages that have been specialized for specific tasks, such as tentacles equipped with sampling devices or secondary arms that end in writing implements for record-keeping duties. The primary responsibility of Plaguebearers involves the endless task of counting and cataloging every disease, infection, and act of decay that occurs throughout the galaxy. This monumental undertaking requires each demon to maintain awareness of countless separate disease vectors, while tracking their progression through various stages of development and transmission. The mental faculties necessary for this work have been enhanced far beyond mortal limitations, allowing individual Plaguebearers to process vast amounts of information simultaneously while maintaining perfect accuracy in their calculations. The counting process itself follows ritualistic patterns that reflect the sacred nature of numbers within Nurgle's philosophy. Each Plaguebearer maintains running tallies of their assigned diseases using a complex system of notation that incorporates both numerical values and symbolic representations of infection types. These calculations continue without pause, even during combat operations, as the demons recognize that their administrative duties take precedence over all other considerations. The rhythmic chanting that accompanies this counting serves both as a form of meditation and as a method of coordination between different units. The record-keeping responsibilities of Plaguebearers extend beyond simple enumeration to include detailed documentation of disease characteristics, transmission patterns, and effectiveness against various target populations. Each demon maintains extensive files on the infections under their purview, updating these records constantly as new information becomes available. The filing systems employed for this purpose combine physical storage methods with psychic impression techniques that allow vast amounts of data to be compressed into manageable formats. The relationship between individual Plaguebearers and their assigned diseases develops into a form of intimate partnership that transcends simple professional responsibility. Each demon comes to understand the unique characteristics and needs of their charges, developing specialized techniques for cultivation and deployment that maximize the effectiveness of each plague strain. This personal investment in their work creates a sense of pride and ownership that motivates the demons to achieve exceptional results in their assigned tasks. The military capabilities of Plaguebearers combine their natural resilience with weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit their unique abilities. Their standard armament consists of plague swords that have been forged from the same diseased metal found throughout Nurgle's domain, their edges constantly weeping infectious fluids that can corrupt both organic and mechanical systems. These weapons demonstrate remarkable durability while maintaining the flexibility necessary for precise combat maneuvers, allowing their wielders to engage multiple opponents simultaneously without compromising their effectiveness. The combat doctrine employed by Plaguebearer formations emphasizes steady advancement and overwhelming enemy positions through sheer persistence rather than dramatic tactical maneuvers. These demons excel at maintaining formation integrity under fire, their supernatural constitution allowing them to absorb tremendous amounts of damage while continuing to advance toward their objectives. The infectious nature of their presence creates additional challenges for enemy forces, as prolonged exposure to Plaguebearer formations inevitably results in the spread of various diseases through opposing ranks. The tactical flexibility of Plaguebearer units allows them to adapt their approach according to the specific requirements of each engagement. When facing heavily armored opponents, they can concentrate their attacks on vulnerable joints and seals, introducing infections that will gradually degrade enemy equipment from within. Against lightly protected targets, they can deploy area effect weapons that create clouds of infectious spores capable of incapacitating entire formations simultaneously. The Nurglings represent the most numerous and ubiquitous of Nurgle's demon servants, existing as diminutive manifestations of mischief and minor corruption that swarm throughout both his domain and the material universe. These small entities embody the playful aspect of decay, approaching their duties with an enthusiasm and joy that contrasts sharply with the grim seriousness typically associated with the forces of chaos. Their appearance combines elements of childlike innocence with obvious signs of disease and corruption, creating beings that are simultaneously endearing and repulsive to mortal observers. The physical form of a typical Nurgling resembles a miniature version of Nurgle himself, complete with the characteristic bloated belly and jovial expression that marks them as products of the Plague Father's own essence. Their skin displays the same mottled green coloration found in their larger cousins, though individual specimens may show variations in hue depending on their age and the specific diseases they carry. The flesh appears soft and yielding, with a texture that suggests overripe fruit while maintaining enough structural integrity to support their active lifestyle. The size of Nurglings varies considerably, with most specimens ranging from the dimensions of a small child to those of a house cat, though exceptional individuals may grow larger or remain smaller depending on their specific role and the favor shown to them by their patron. Their proportions emphasize their rotund bellies and stubby limbs, giving them an appearance that would be comical if not for the obvious signs of disease that mark their forms. The combination of childlike features with visible decay creates a disturbing contrast that reflects the complex nature of Nurgle's gifts. The spawning process that creates Nurglings occurs continuously throughout Nurgle's domain, with new individuals emerging from the Plague Father's own body, as well as from the flesh of his greater servants. This reproductive method ensures a constant supply of fresh demons while creating familial bonds between the newly spawned entities and their progenitors. The process itself appears spontaneous, with Nurglings simply budding from their parents' flesh when conditions are favorable for their emergence. The role of Nurglings within Nurgle's hierarchy combines elements of maintenance work, espionage, and general mischief-making that serves the greater purposes of their patron. These small demons swarm throughout the Garden of Nurgle, performing countless minor tasks that keep the vast ecosystem functioning smoothly. They serve as living sensors that monitor environmental conditions, as messengers that carry information between different regions of the domain, and as workers that perform routine maintenance on the various structures and experiments scattered throughout the realm. The maintenance duties performed by Nurglings require them to possess a wide range of specialized skills and abilities that allow them to work with the exotic materials and organisms found throughout Nurgle's domain. They serve as living tools that can access confined spaces, manipulate delicate equipment, and perform repairs on systems that would be impossible for larger entities to service. Their small size and natural agility make them ideal for working within the complex organic machinery that powers much of the domain's infrastructure. The espionage capabilities of Nurglings make them invaluable assets for gathering intelligence about enemy activities and monitoring the effectiveness of Nurgle's various schemes. Their diminutive size allows them to infiltrate enemy positions undetected, while their natural resistance to most forms of damage ensures that they can survive in hostile environments long enough to complete their missions. The information they gather is transmitted back to their superiors through a combination of direct reporting and psychic impression techniques that allow for rapid communication across vast distances. The mischievous nature of Nurglings manifests in their tendency to cause minor disruptions and annoyances that serve to weaken enemy morale while providing entertainment for their fellow demons. These activities range from simple pranks that embarrass their targets to more serious sabotage efforts that can compromise enemy equipment and supplies. The seemingly random nature of these actions often conceals careful planning designed to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing the risk of detection. The infectious capabilities of Nurglings allow them to serve as highly effective disease vectors despite their small size and apparently harmless appearance. Each individual carries a variety of minor infections that can spread rapidly through target populations, creating conditions that favor the deployment of more serious plagues. The diseases spread by Nurglings typically produce symptoms that are annoying rather than immediately life-threatening, allowing them to establish themselves within enemy populations before more serious infections are introduced. The beast demons that serve within Nurgle's legions represent specialized creatures that have been adapted for specific combat roles and environmental conditions. These entities combine the basic characteristics of their patron's influence with features derived from various animal species, creating hybrid forms that excel at particular types of warfare while maintaining the infectious nature that characterizes all of Nurgle's servants. The diversity of these creatures reflects the endless creativity of decay, with new forms constantly emerging to meet the changing needs of the Plaguefather's campaigns. The plague drones constitute one of the most recognizable and feared types of beast demon within Nurgle's forces, combining the mobility of flying insects with the infectious payload delivery capabilities required for effective biological warfare. These creatures appear as massive flies whose bodies have been swollen to accommodate both their demon riders and the various disease-carrying organs that make them so effective in combat. Their wings produce a distinctive droning sound that can be heard from great distances, serving both as a psychological weapon and as a means of coordination between different units. The anatomy of a plague drone reflects the fusion of insect characteristics with demonic enhancements that allow them to function as effective weapons platforms. Their compound eyes provide exceptional visual acuity across multiple spectrums, allowing them to track individual targets while maintaining awareness of overall battlefield conditions. The proboscis has been modified to serve as both a feeding apparatus and a delivery system for various biological agents, capable of injecting precise doses of specific infections into selected targets. The relationship between plague drones and their Plaguebearer riders creates a symbiotic partnership that enhances the capabilities of both entities. The riders provide intelligence and tactical direction, while the mounts supply mobility and specialized attack capabilities, creating combined units that are far more effective than either component would be individually. This partnership extends beyond simple cooperation to include emotional bonds that motivate both entities to perform at their maximum potential during combat operations. The rot flies that serve as the basic mount for plague drone formations represent creatures that have been specifically bred and modified for their role as aerial platforms. These beings combine the natural flight capabilities of their insect origins with enhanced durability and payload capacity that allows them to operate effectively in combat environments. Their bodies constantly produce and release various airborne pathogens that create hazardous conditions for enemy forces while providing beneficial effects for friendly units. The Daemon Engines that serve within Nurgle's forces represent the fusion of mechanical technology with organic corruption, creating vehicles and weapon systems that combine the reliability of machinery with the adaptive capabilities of living organisms. These entities demonstrate the Plaguefather's ability to corrupt and transform even the most advanced technological systems, turning them into servants that embody his philosophy of decay and renewal. The appearance of these engines reflects their hybrid nature, with mechanical components that have been overgrown and integrated with organic materials to create new forms of existence. The creation process for Daemon Engines involves the careful integration of captured or salvaged mechanical systems, with specially cultivated organic components that serve to animate and control the resulting hybrid entities. This process requires extensive knowledge of both technological systems and biological processes, making it one of the most challenging forms of demon creation practiced within Nurgle's domain. The resulting entities demonstrate capabilities that exceed those of their purely mechanical or organic predecessors, combining the best features of both types of systems. The operational capabilities of these Daemon Engines make them invaluable assets for siege warfare and other operations that require the deployment of heavy weapons and specialized equipment. Their mechanical components provide the durability and firepower necessary for engaging heavily armored targets, while their organic elements allow for self-repair and adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. The fusion of these capabilities creates weapons systems that can maintain effectiveness over extended periods while adapting to counter enemy defensive measures. The transformation of the 14th Legion from the stalwart defenders of humanity into Nurgle's most devoted servants represents one of the most tragic and complete falls from grace in the annals of the Horus Heresy. Once known as the Dusk Raiders before their reunion with their Primarch, the Death Guard had built a reputation for methodical warfare and unwavering endurance that made them ideal candidates for the most grinding campaigns of the Great Crusade. Their ability to fight in the most hazardous environments, from toxic wastelands to plague-ridden hive cities, had made them invaluable assets to the Emperor's expansion across the galaxy. This very resilience, however, would ultimately make their corruption all the more profound when they finally succumbed to the Plague Father's gifts. The Death Guard's pre-heresy culture emphasized stoic endurance and grim determination in the face of adversity. Their recruitment practices favored candidates who demonstrated exceptional tolerance for pain and environmental hazards, creating a legion composed of warriors who could function effectively in conditions that would incapacitate other space marines. The Terran-born Dusk Raiders had developed these characteristics through centuries of warfare in the Sol system's most inhospitable regions, while later recruits from Barbaros brought their own traditions of survival in toxic environments that complemented the Legion's existing strengths. The organizational structure of the Death Guard reflected their methodical approach to warfare, with each company specialized for specific types of hazardous environment operations. The Legion maintained extensive chemical warfare capabilities, including specialized equipment for operating in atmospheres that would be lethal to unprotected humans. Their apothecaries had developed advanced techniques for treating exposure to exotic toxins and diseases, while their Techmarines had created sealed armor systems that could function in the most contaminated battlefields. These preparations, intended to protect the Legion from external threats, would prove tragically inadequate against the corruption that would eventually consume them from within. The Death Guard's tactical doctrine emphasized steady advancement and overwhelming firepower rather than rapid assault or complex maneuvers. Their preferred method of warfare involved the systematic reduction of enemy positions through concentrated bombardment, followed by methodical infantry advances that ground down resistance through sheer persistence. This approach had proven highly effective during the Great Crusade, allowing the Legion to claim victory in campaigns where other forces had failed due to environmental hazards or enemy resilience. The patience and determination required for such warfare had become deeply ingrained in the Legion's character, creating mental attitudes that would later make them susceptible to Nurgle's philosophy of acceptance and endurance. The reunion of the Death Guard with their Primarch Mortarion marked the beginning of changes that would ultimately lead to their downfall. Mortarion brought with him the warriors of Barbaros, men who had been forged in the toxic mists of their homeworld, and who possessed an intimate understanding of survival in poisonous environments. The integration of these new recruits with the existing Terran forces created a legion that combined the disciplined professionalism of the Dusk Raiders with the grim endurance of Barbaros's survivors. This fusion of cultures strengthened the Legion's capabilities while also introducing philosophical elements that would prove crucial to their eventual corruption. Mortarion's own experiences on Barbaros had shaped his understanding of warfare and survival in ways that would prove prophetic. His adoption by one of the planet's toxic overlords had exposed him to environments that would have killed normal humans instantly, while his eventual rebellion against his foster father had required him to develop strategies for fighting enemies who possessed superior knowledge of chemical and biological warfare. The techniques he had learned during these formative experiences were passed on to his legion, creating a force that was uniquely prepared for the types of warfare they would eventually face as servants of Nurgle. The Death Guard's participation in the early stages of the Horus Heresy followed predictable patterns based on their established tactical preferences and organizational strengths. Their methodical approach to warfare made them valuable assets for siege operations and campaigns that required sustained pressure against well-defended positions. The Legion's reputation for reliability and endurance meant that they were often assigned to the most challenging and prolonged engagements, where their ability to maintain effectiveness over extended periods proved crucial to overall strategic success. The fateful voyage that would seal the Death Guard's transformation began as a routine fleet movement during the Heresy's chaotic middle period. The Legion's ships, carrying the bulk of their forces, became trapped in warp storms that prevented normal navigation and communication with the outside universe. The extended duration of this enforced isolation created conditions that allowed Nurgle's influence to gradually penetrate the fleet's defenses, beginning with subtle environmental changes that initially appeared to be routine equipment failures or minor atmospheric contamination. The progression of corruption within the trapped fleet followed patterns that reflected both the Death Guard's existing vulnerabilities and Nurgle's patient approach to conversion. The initial symptoms appeared as minor respiratory ailments and skin irritations that seemed consistent with extended exposure to recycled ship atmosphere. The Legion's medical personnel, despite their extensive training in treating exotic diseases, found themselves unable to identify the specific pathogens responsible for these conditions or to develop effective treatments for the steadily worsening symptoms. As the mysterious plague spread throughout the fleet, the Death Guard's stoic nature initially worked in their favor, allowing them to maintain discipline and operational effectiveness even as their physical condition deteriorated. The warriors of the Legion had been trained to function despite injury and illness, viewing such hardships as tests of their dedication and resolve. This mental conditioning prevented panic and maintained unit cohesion during the early stages of the outbreak, but it also prevented them from taking decisive action to halt the spread of infection before it reached critical levels. The role of Kala's Typhon, the Death Guard's first captain, proved crucial during this period of crisis and transformation. Typhon had long harbored secret knowledge of the warp's true nature and had been preparing for an opportunity to guide his legion toward what he believed was their true destiny. His understanding of Nurgle's gifts allowed him to recognize the plague's supernatural origins while concealing this knowledge from his battle brothers, positioning himself as both a source of information and a guide toward acceptance of their changing nature. Typhon's manipulation of the situation demonstrated the subtle nature of Nurgle's corruption, which worked through existing relationships and trust rather than obvious external coercion. His position as first captain provided him with the authority and credibility necessary to influence his brothers' responses to the crisis, while his genuine concern for their welfare masked his true intentions. The advice he provided appeared reasonable and based on sound military principles, making it difficult for other members of the Legion to recognize the corrupting influence behind his suggestions. The physical transformation of the Death Guard during their extended voyage reflected the gradual nature of Nurgle's gifts, with changes occurring slowly enough that individual warriors could adapt to their new conditions without experiencing the psychological shock that might have prompted resistance. The initial symptoms of respiratory distress and skin lesions gradually evolved into more exotic manifestations that enhanced rather than hindered the Legion's combat capabilities. Warriors found that their endurance increased even as their appearance became more grotesque, while their tolerance for environmental hazards reached levels that surpassed even their previous exceptional standards. The psychological aspects of the transformation proved equally important, as the Death Guard gradually learned to accept and even embrace their changing nature. The Stoic philosophy that had always characterized the Legion provided a framework for understanding their condition as a test of their resolve rather than a curse to be fought against. This mental adaptation was crucial to their eventual complete conversion, as it allowed them to find meaning and purpose in their suffering rather than viewing it as a defeat or failure. Mortarian's own transformation during this period represented the culmination of vulnerabilities that had been present throughout his life, but had never been fully exposed. His experiences on Barbaros had taught him to endure toxic environments and to find strength through suffering, but they had also created psychological patterns that made him susceptible to Nurgle's influence. The gradual realization that his Legion was beyond conventional salvation forced him to confront choices that challenged his fundamental beliefs about duty, sacrifice, and the nature of existence itself. The Primarch's decision to embrace Nurgle's gifts came not from weakness or cowardice, but from a desperate desire to preserve his sons in some form, rather than watch them die from conditions beyond his ability to treat. This choice reflected the paternal nature of his relationship with the Legion, while also demonstrating the insidious way that Nurgle's corruption could transform even noble motivations into instruments of damnation. The moment of his final acceptance marked the completion of the Death Guard's transformation from loyal space marines into willing servants of the Plague Father. The emergence of the Death Guard from their warp-bound voyage revealed the full extent of their transformation to the wider galaxy. The warriors who had entered the warp storms as disciplined soldiers of the Emperor emerged as something fundamentally different, their bodies and minds reshaped by exposure to Nurgle's gifts. Their appearance had become grotesque by conventional standards, with bloated forms that wept constant streams of infectious fluid and faces that bore the marks of advanced decay. Yet their combat effectiveness had increased rather than diminished, as their new nature provided them with capabilities that exceeded their previous limitations. The organizational structure of the transformed Death Guard reflected both their original military traditions and the new realities of their existence as servants of Nurgle. The Legion maintained its basic company structure while adapting to accommodate the specialized roles required by their new nature. The traditional positions of captain, sergeant, and battle brother remained, but their responsibilities had evolved to include the cultivation and deployment of various plague strains alongside conventional military duties. The plague companies that emerged from this reorganization represented specialized formations designed to maximize the effectiveness of specific disease types and deployment methods. Each company developed expertise in particular aspects of biological warfare, from the creation of airborne pathogens to the development of contact-based infections that could spread through enemy formations. The rivalry between different companies centered not on traditional military achievements, but on the development of increasingly creative and effective plague variants. The Vectoriums that served as the basic tactical units within each plague company combined the Death Guard's traditional emphasis on methodical warfare with the new capabilities provided by their transformed nature. These formations typically consisted of 7 squads, reflecting Nurgle's sacred number, with each squad specialized for specific aspects of plague warfare. The coordination between different Vectoriums allowed for complex biological warfare campaigns that could target multiple enemy vulnerabilities simultaneously while maintaining the sustained pressure that had always characterized Death Guard operations. Mortarian's role as Demon Primarch of the Death Guard represented a fundamental change in both his nature and his relationship with his sons. His transformation had elevated him beyond the physical limitations of his original form, while binding him more closely to Nurgle's will and purpose. The abilities granted by his new status allowed him to perceive the flow of disease across vast distances and to coordinate plague campaigns on a galactic scale, making him one of the most dangerous opponents faced by the Imperium during the long millennia following the heresy. The Primarch's new form reflected the same combination of power and corruption that characterized his legion, with a body that had grown to enormous proportions while taking on the characteristics of advanced decay. His presence alone could contaminate entire regions, while his breath carried plagues that could devastate enemy populations. The massive scythe he wielded, known as Silence, had been reforged by Nurgle's own hand to serve as both weapon and symbol of his authority over the forces of pestilence. Mortarian's command style as Demon Primarch emphasized the patient, methodical approach that had always characterized the Death Guard, while incorporating the new strategic possibilities provided by their supernatural nature. His campaigns typically involved the gradual contamination of target regions through multiple plague vectors, creating conditions that weakened enemy defenses before the main assault began. This approach reflected both his understanding of conventional warfare and his appreciation for the subtle ways that disease could achieve objectives that direct military action might not accomplish. The relationship between Mortarion and his transformed sons had evolved to reflect their new nature, while maintaining the paternal bonds that had always characterized their legion. The Primarch's ability to perceive the health and condition of individual Death Guard warriors allowed him to provide guidance and support that addressed their specific needs and circumstances. This intimate knowledge of his forces enabled him to deploy them with maximum effectiveness while ensuring that their unique capabilities were properly utilized. Typhus the Traveler, formerly known as Kala's Typhon, had emerged from the Legion's transformation as one of Nurgle's most favored champions, and a figure whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of the Death Guard itself. His role in orchestrating the Legion's fall had earned him special recognition from the Plague Father, who had granted him abilities and responsibilities that made him effectively independent of normal command structures. The title of Herald of Nurgle reflected his function as a spreader of disease throughout the galaxy, with authority to act according to his own judgment in pursuing the Plague Father's goals. Typhus's physical transformation had been more extensive than that of most Death Guard warriors, with his body becoming a living hive for countless disease organisms that existed in symbiotic relationship with his enhanced physiology. His armor, known as the Cataphracti Terminator Plate, had fused with his flesh to create a hybrid system that provided protection while serving as a breeding ground for new plague strains. The various tubes and apparatus that covered his form constantly produced and released airborne pathogens that could contaminate entire battlefields. The destroyer hive that surrounded Typhus represented one of the most virulent collections of disease organisms ever assembled, with each component carefully selected and cultivated to maximize its effectiveness against specific types of targets. The swarm included bacteria that could consume metal and ceramite, viruses that could corrupt machine spirits, and exotic organisms that could survive in the vacuum of space. The coordination between these different elements created a biological weapon system that could adapt to virtually any environment or enemy defensive measure. The command responsibilities of Typhus extended beyond his role within the Death Guard to encompass broader strategic objectives that served Nurgle's galactic agenda. His ability to travel independently through the warp allowed him to coordinate plague campaigns across multiple sectors while maintaining communication with other servants of the Plague Father. The intelligence networks he had established provided valuable information about enemy movements and vulnerabilities, making him an invaluable asset for planning large-scale operations. The other notable champions of the Death Guard reflected the diversity of approaches that could be taken in serving Nurgle's purposes while maintaining the core characteristics that define the Legion. These individuals had each found their own ways to excel within their transformed nature, developing specialized skills and capabilities that made them valuable assets for specific types of operations. Their achievements demonstrated the potential for growth and advancement that existed within the Legion's new structure, providing inspiration and guidance for younger warriors seeking to prove their worth. The Plague Marines that formed the backbone of the Death Guard's fighting strength represented the successful integration of Space Marine training and discipline with the gifts provided by Nurgle's corruption. These warriors maintained the tactical skills and combat effectiveness that had made them formidable opponents during the Great Crusade, while gaining new capabilities that enhanced their lethality and survivability. Their ability to function in environments that would be instantly lethal to normal humans made them ideal for operations in the most hazardous regions of the galaxy. The equipment and weapons employed by the Death Guard had undergone modifications that reflected their new nature, while maintaining the reliability and effectiveness that had always characterized their gear. Bolters had been adapted to fire ammunition that carried various disease payloads, while close combat weapons had been enhanced with organic components that could inject toxins or beneficial bacteria depending on the tactical situation. The integration of these modifications with existing equipment created weapons systems that were both familiar and alien, reflecting the Legion's transformation from loyal servants to willing agents of corruption. The transformation of mortal populations into willing servants of Nurgle represents one of the most insidious and widespread threats facing the Imperium, as ordinary citizens gradually succumb to the Plaguefather's influence through exposure to his gifts and the seductive promise of release from suffering. Unlike the dramatic conversions that mark the fall of Space Marines or other elite warriors, the corruption of civilian populations occurs through subtle processes that exploit the fundamental vulnerabilities of human nature. The desperate circumstances that characterize life in the 41st millennium create ideal conditions for Nurgle's influence to take root, as billions of Imperial citizens struggle with disease, starvation, and the constant threat of death that makes the Plaguefather's message of acceptance increasingly appealing. The hive worlds that serve as the primary population centers of the Imperium provide particularly fertile ground for Nurgle's corruption, as their massive urban complexes create environmental conditions that favor the spread of both disease and the philosophical despair that feeds the Plaguefather's power. The lower levels of these cities, where the majority of the population struggles to survive in conditions of perpetual darkness and contamination, exist in a state of constant crisis that makes them vulnerable to any influence that promises relief from their suffering. The overcrowded living conditions, inadequate sanitation systems, and polluted air supplies create natural breeding grounds for disease that can be easily exploited by those who understand the principles of biological warfare. The plague cults that emerge within these urban environments typically begin as informal support networks among individuals who share similar afflictions, or who have witnessed the failure of Imperial medical services to address their needs. These groups initially form around practical concerns, such as sharing information about treatment methods or providing mutual aid during periods of particular hardship. The transformation from legitimate medical support group to heretical cult occurs gradually, as members begin to interpret their suffering through philosophical frameworks that emphasize acceptance rather than resistance. The recruitment methods employed by established plague cults demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics, targeting individuals who have reached states of desperation that make them receptive to alternative explanations for their circumstances. The cult members who serve as recruiters are typically individuals who have successfully adapted to their afflictions and who can demonstrate the peace and contentment that comes from accepting Nurgle's gifts. Their approach emphasizes empathy and understanding rather than coercion, creating relationships of trust that allow for the gradual introduction of increasingly heretical concepts. The initiation process for new cult members involves a series of stages designed to gradually acclimate recruits to the philosophical and practical aspects of serving Nurgle. The early stages focus on providing genuine relief from suffering through techniques that appear to be conventional medical treatments, but which actually involve exposure to beneficial bacteria and minor infections that begin the process of physical transformation. The psychological aspects of initiation emphasize the development of acceptance and gratitude for the experiences that have brought the recruit to their current state, reframing suffering as a gift rather than a burden. The organizational structure of urban plague cults reflects the need for secrecy and operational security while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective disease cultivation and distribution. The cellular organization typical of these groups allows for compartmentalization that protects the overall organization even if individual members are discovered by imperial authorities. Each cell typically consists of 7 members, reflecting Nurgle's sacred number, with one individual serving as the connection to higher levels of the organization, while the others focus on specific aspects of the cult's activities. The leadership hierarchy within major plague cults combines elements of democratic participation with recognition of expertise and spiritual advancement. The most influential positions are typically held by individuals who have achieved advanced stages of physical transformation while maintaining the mental clarity necessary for strategic planning and coordination. These leaders serve as both spiritual guides and practical administrators, providing direction for the cult's activities while ensuring that individual members receive the support and guidance necessary for their continued development. The daily activities of plague cult members encompass both the routine tasks necessary for survival within imperial society and the specialized work required to advance Nurgle's agenda. Many cultists maintain conventional employment that provides them with access to water supplies, food distribution systems, or medical facilities that can be used to spread their patrons' gifts. The integration of heretical activities with legitimate work creates opportunities for widespread contamination while providing cover that makes detection by imperial authorities extremely difficult. The agricultural death cults that operate in the rural regions of imperial worlds represent a different approach to serving Nurgle that takes advantage of the close relationship between farming communities and the natural cycles of growth and decay. These organizations typically emerge in areas where crop failures, livestock diseases, or environmental contamination have created conditions of desperation that make the local population receptive to alternative explanations for their circumstances. The connection between agricultural work and the fundamental processes of life and death provides a natural framework for understanding Nurgle's philosophy in ways that urban populations might find more difficult to grasp. The recruitment strategies employed by agricultural cults focus on demonstrating practical benefits that can be achieved through the application of Nurgle's gifts to farming and animal husbandry. Potential converts are shown techniques for improving crop yields through the introduction of beneficial bacteria and fungi, while livestock breeding programs demonstrate how controlled exposure to certain diseases can create animals that are more resistant to common ailments. The tangible benefits provided by these methods create credibility that allows for the gradual introduction of more explicitly heretical concepts. The seasonal festivals and celebrations that characterize rural life provide opportunities for agricultural cults to reinforce their message while building community bonds that strengthen the organization's influence. These events typically involve rituals that celebrate the cycles of growth and decay that govern agricultural life, with ceremonies that honor the role of death in creating conditions for new life. The integration of heretical elements with traditional celebrations makes it difficult for participants to recognize the point at which legitimate agricultural practices become acts of worship directed toward the Plague Father. The corruption process that transforms ordinary mortals into willing servants of Nurgle operates through mechanisms that exploit both physical vulnerabilities and psychological predispositions that make individuals susceptible to the Plague Father's influence. The initial stages of this process typically involve exposure to diseases that produce symptoms severe enough to cause significant suffering, but not so severe as to result in immediate death. The prolonged nature of these afflictions creates opportunities for the gradual introduction of philosophical concepts that reframe the experience of illness as a form of spiritual education. The physical aspects of corruption involve the introduction of specially cultivated organisms that establish symbiotic relationships with their human hosts rather than simply causing damage and death. These organisms provide their hosts with enhanced resistance to environmental hazards and improved recovery rates from injuries, creating tangible benefits that demonstrate the value of accepting Nurgle's gifts. The visible signs of infection that accompany these improvements serve as markers of spiritual advancement within cult communities, creating social pressures that encourage further transformation. The psychological transformation that accompanies physical corruption involves the gradual replacement of conventional attitudes toward health and disease with perspectives that emphasize acceptance and gratitude for all forms of experience. The process typically begins with the recognition that resistance to illness often causes more suffering than the disease itself, leading to the adoption of more passive approaches to medical treatment. This acceptance gradually expands to encompass broader philosophical concepts about the nature of existence and the role of suffering in spiritual development. The community aspects of the corruption process create social environments that reinforce and accelerate individual transformation through peer pressure and mutual support. The shared experience of disease and transformation creates bonds between cult members that are stronger than those found in conventional social groups, while the exclusion from normal society that results from visible infection creates dependencies that make leaving the cult extremely difficult. The combination of positive reinforcement from fellow cultists and negative reactions from the broader population creates psychological pressures that encourage continued commitment to the organization. The notable mortal champions who have achieved recognition within Nurgle's hierarchy represent individuals who have successfully navigated the corruption process while developing specialized skills that make them valuable assets for advancing the Plague Father's agenda. These champions typically possess combinations of charismatic leadership, strategic intelligence, and spiritual insight that allow them to coordinate complex operations while inspiring loyalty among their followers. Their achievements serve as examples of the potential for advancement that exists within Nurgle's service, providing motivation for other cultists to pursue similar paths. The career of Valdis Malinax, a former Imperial Guard officer who became one of the most successful Plague cult leaders in the Segmentum Solar, demonstrates the potential for rapid advancement that exists for individuals who embrace Nurgle's gifts with appropriate enthusiasm and intelligence. Malinax's military background provided him with tactical skills and organizational experience that proved invaluable when applied to the coordination of disease campaigns across multiple worlds. His transformation from loyal Imperial officer to heretical cult leader occurred over a period of several years, during which he gradually recognized the futility of fighting against the inevitable decay that characterizes all human endeavors. The methods employed by Malinax in building his organization reflect sophisticated understanding of both military logistics and cult psychology, combining conventional command structures with the spiritual elements necessary for maintaining loyalty among followers who have undergone significant physical and mental transformation. His network of subordinate leaders includes individuals with diverse backgrounds and specializations, from former medical professionals who understand the technical aspects of disease cultivation to charismatic preachers who can inspire devotion among new recruits. The coordination between these different elements creates an organization that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining focus on long-term strategic objectives. The Plague campaigns orchestrated by Malinax demonstrate the potential for mortal servants to achieve results that rival those of demonic forces through careful planning and patient execution. His operations typically involve the simultaneous deployment of multiple disease vectors across target populations, creating conditions that overwhelm local medical resources while preventing effective countermeasures. The timing of these campaigns takes advantage of existing stresses such as food shortages or political unrest that make target populations more vulnerable to infection and less capable of organized resistance. The relationship between Nurgle cults and other chaos factions represents a complex web of cooperation, competition, and conflict that reflects the broader dynamics of the Dark God's eternal struggle for dominance. The patient, methodical approach favored by Nurgle's servants often conflicts with the more aggressive tactics employed by followers of Khorne, or the excessive indulgence characteristic of Slaanesh worshippers. However, the practical benefits provided by plague cults in terms of weakening enemy populations and creating favorable conditions for other chaos operations ensure that these organizations maintain value as allies despite philosophical differences. The cooperation between plague cults and Khornate warrior bands typically involves arrangements where the cultists provide intelligence and logistical support in exchange for protection from imperial authorities and rival organizations. The plague cult's networks of informants and their ability to operate undetected within imperial society make them valuable assets for planning military operations, while their disease campaigns can weaken enemy forces before conventional attacks begin. The relationship remains tense due to fundamental differences in approach, with Khornate forces often viewing the cultists' methods as cowardly and indirect. The interactions between Nurgle cults and followers of Slaanesh create particularly complex dynamics due to the overlapping interests both factions have in the corruption of imperial society. The hedonistic pursuits favored by Slaanesh worshippers often create conditions that facilitate the spread of disease, while the altered states of consciousness produced by certain infections can enhance the sensory experiences that Slaanesh's followers seek. However, the philosophical emphasis on acceptance and contentment that characterizes Nurgles gifts conflicts with the constant desire for new experiences that drives Slaanesh's servants. The mixed allegiances that develop among some chaos cultists reflect the complex nature of corruption and the overlapping spheres of influence maintained by the different dark gods. Individuals who have been exposed to multiple forms of chaos corruption may develop hybrid belief systems that incorporate elements from different patrons, creating theological complications that can lead to internal conflicts within cult organizations. These mixed loyalties can provide advantages in terms of accessing diverse resources and capabilities, but they also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by enemies or rival factions. The conflicts that arise between different chaos factions often center on competition for the same recruitment pools and operational territories, with each group seeking to establish dominance over specific populations or geographic regions. The subtle nature of Nurgle's corruption methods can create situations where plague cults establish influence over communities that are simultaneously being targeted by other chaos organizations, leading to confrontations that weaken all parties involved. The resolution of these conflicts typically depends on the relative strength and organization of the competing factions rather than any formal arbitration process. The imperial response to plague cult activities reflects the broader challenges faced by the Imperium in dealing with chaos corruption that operates through social and biological vectors rather than direct military action. The Inquisition's specialized Ordo Malleus maintains responsibility for investigating and combating chaos cults, but the subtle nature of Nurgle's influence makes detection and elimination extremely difficult. The symptoms of cult activity often appear to be natural disease outbreaks or social problems that fall within the jurisdiction of other imperial organizations, creating coordination challenges that can delay effective responses. The investigative techniques employed by inquisitorial forces in dealing with plague cults require specialized knowledge of both medical science and chaos corruption that few individuals possess. The ability to distinguish between natural disease outbreaks and supernatural corruption requires extensive training and experience, while the investigation of cult activities must be conducted with extreme caution to avoid exposure to infectious agents. The personnel assigned to these investigations typically include individuals with backgrounds in medical research, biological warfare, and xenobiology who can analyze evidence and develop countermeasures. The countermeasures developed by imperial authorities to combat plague cult activities encompass both immediate responses to active outbreaks and long-term strategies for preventing the establishment of new organizations. The immediate response typically involves quarantine procedures designed to contain the spread of infection, while specialized teams work to identify and eliminate cult members. The long-term prevention strategies focus on improving living conditions and medical services in areas that are particularly vulnerable to cult recruitment, though resource limitations often prevent the implementation of comprehensive programs. The effectiveness of imperial countermeasures varies significantly depending on the specific circumstances of each outbreak and the resources available to responding forces. The early detection of cult activities allows for more effective intervention, but the subtle nature of Nurgle's corruption often means that organizations become well established before their true nature is recognized. The success of elimination efforts depends heavily on the ability to identify and neutralize cult leadership while preventing the spread of infection to response personnel. The 41st millennium has witnessed the emergence of plague strains that surpass even the most virulent diseases of earlier eras, as Nurgle's influence has grown stronger through 10,000 years of accumulated suffering, and the plague fathers patient cultivation of ever more sophisticated biological weapons. These modern contagions represent the culmination of millennia of experimentation within the Garden of Nurgle, where the fundamental principles of disease transmission and adaptation have been refined through exposure to the chaotic energies of the warp. The result is a collection of plagues that demonstrate capabilities far beyond those of natural pathogens, combining supernatural resilience with adaptive mechanisms that allow them to overcome even the most advanced medical countermeasures developed by imperial science. The zombie plague stands as perhaps the most devastating example of Nurgle's evolved biological warfare capabilities, representing a disease that fundamentally alters the relationship between life and death in ways that challenge imperial understanding of both medical science and the nature of mortality itself. This contagion first manifested during the latter centuries of the 41st millennium, appearing simultaneously across multiple worlds in different sectors, without any apparent connection between the initial outbreak sites. The plague's ability to manifest spontaneously in isolated locations suggested supernatural origins that went beyond conventional disease transmission, indicating direct intervention from the warp rather than simple biological contamination. The pathological progression of the zombie plague follows patterns that defy conventional medical understanding, beginning with symptoms that appear consistent with common respiratory infections, but rapidly evolving into conditions that fundamentally alter the victim's physiological processes. The initial stage presents as a persistent cough accompanied by low-grade fever and general malaise, symptoms that are sufficiently common in imperial populations to avoid immediate medical attention. The infected individual remains functional and capable of normal activities during this phase, which typically lasts between 7 and 14 days, depending on the victim's overall health and immune system response. The secondary stage marks the beginning of the plague's more exotic manifestations, as the infected individual begins to experience episodes of altered consciousness that suggest neurological involvement beyond simple fever-induced delirium. Victims report periods of memory loss accompanied by compulsions to seek out crowded areas where they can spread the infection through respiratory droplets and physical contact. The psychological changes during this phase appear to be directed toward maximizing transmission opportunities rather than representing random neurological damage, suggesting that the plague possesses some form of rudimentary intelligence or programmed behavior patterns. The transformation phase represents the most dramatic aspect of the zombie plague's progression, as victims undergo changes that fundamentally alter their biological status while maintaining a form of animated existence that challenges conventional definitions of life and death. The process typically begins with the cessation of normal cardiac and respiratory functions, followed by the onset of rigor mortis and other signs of clinical death. However, within hours of apparent death, the corpse begins to show signs of renewed animation, with the deceased individual rising and displaying behaviors that suggest the retention of basic motor functions and primitive cognitive abilities. The reanimated victims of the zombie plague demonstrate capabilities that exceed those of normal human corpses while exhibiting limitations that distinguish them from living individuals. Their physical strength appears to be enhanced beyond normal human parameters, allowing them to break through barriers and restraints that would contain living prisoners. However, their coordination and fine motor control are severely compromised, resulting in shambling movements and impaired ability to manipulate complex objects or tools. The sensory capabilities of these reanimated individuals appear to be focused primarily on detecting living humans, with particular sensitivity to body heat and the scent of healthy blood. The infectious mechanism employed by reanimated plague victims involves the transmission of the disease through bite wounds and other forms of direct fluid contact, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of infection and reanimation that can rapidly overwhelm local populations. The bite wounds inflicted by these creatures carry concentrations of the plague organism that are significantly higher than those found in the initial respiratory transmission phase, resulting in accelerated disease progression that can complete the full cycle from infection to reanimation within a matter of hours rather than weeks. The Imperial worlds that have experienced major zombie plague outbreaks demonstrate the devastating potential of this contagion when it gains foothold in populated areas. The hive world of Mordian Prime experienced one of the most severe outbreaks during the closing years of the 41st millennium, when the plague appeared simultaneously in multiple hive cities across the planet's surface. The initial response by local authorities followed standard quarantine procedures, but the rapid progression of the disease and the unexpected behavior of reanimated victims quickly overwhelmed containment efforts. The breakdown of social order on Mordian Prime occurred with shocking rapidity as the reanimated plague victims began to appear in significant numbers throughout the affected hive cities. The disciplined nature of Mordian society, normally a source of strength during crisis situations, became a liability as the population's tendency to gather in organized groups provided ideal conditions for rapid disease transmission. The planet's famous Iron Guard regiments found themselves facing an enemy that their traditional tactics and equipment were poorly suited to combat, as their law's weapons proved ineffective against opponents who felt no pain and could continue fighting despite wounds that would incapacitate living soldiers. The military response to the Mordian Prime outbreak revealed the challenges that Imperial forces face when confronting the zombie plague's unique characteristics. Standard Imperial Guard tactics emphasized the use of ranged weapons and coordinated fire discipline, but these approaches proved inadequate against enemies who could absorb tremendous amounts of damage while continuing to advance. The reanimated plague victims showed no fear of death and could not be demoralized or forced to retreat, requiring Imperial forces to adapt their tactics to emphasize complete destruction of enemy forces rather than tactical defeat. The evacuation efforts conducted during the Mordian Prime crisis demonstrated both the heroism of Imperial personnel and the practical limitations of emergency response procedures when dealing with supernatural contagions. The planet's extensive transportation infrastructure, normally capable of moving millions of citizens efficiently, became a liability as infected individuals used the same systems to spread the plague to previously uncontaminated areas. The decision to destroy key transportation hubs in order to limit disease spread required Imperial commanders to sacrifice thousands of uninfected civilians who could not be evacuated through alternative means. The agricultural world of Belial suffered a different pattern of zombie plague infection that highlighted the disease's ability to adapt to various environmental conditions and population densities. The initial outbreak occurred in the planet's main food processing facilities, where the close quarters and shared equipment provided ideal conditions for rapid transmission among the workforce. The rural nature of Belial's population meant that the plague spread more slowly than it had on Mordian Prime, but the dispersed settlement patterns made it extremely difficult to establish effective quarantine zones or to coordinate military responses. The impact of the zombie plague on Belial's agricultural production created secondary effects that extended far beyond the planet's borders, as the world served as a primary food supplier for several neighboring systems. The contamination of stored grain supplies and processed food products created the potential for the plague to spread to other worlds through normal trade relationships, forcing imperial authorities to implement emergency rationing measures and to seek alternative food sources for affected regions. The economic disruption caused by these measures contributed to social unrest that provided additional opportunities for chaos cults to exploit weakened imperial authority. The walking pox represents another signature disease associated with Nurgle's influence, though its effects and transmission mechanisms differ significantly from those of the zombie plague. This contagion demonstrates the Plague Father's ability to create diseases that serve specific strategic purposes rather than simply causing maximum casualties, as the walking pox appears designed to create long-term psychological and social disruption rather than immediate death. The disease's name derives from the characteristic skin lesions that develop during its progression, which create patterns that resemble pox marks, but which continue to spread and evolve throughout the victim's lifetime. The transmission of the walking pox occurs through multiple vectors simultaneously, including airborne droplets, contaminated surfaces, and direct skin contact, making it extremely difficult to contain once it appears in populated areas. The disease demonstrates remarkable environmental stability, remaining viable on surfaces for extended periods and showing resistance to standard imperial disinfection procedures. The multi-vector transmission capability means that individuals can become infected through routine daily activities, such as touching contaminated door handles, breathing air in enclosed spaces, or participating in normal social interactions. The progression of the walking pox follows a pattern that maximizes its psychological impact while ensuring long-term survival of infected individuals who can serve as ongoing disease reservoirs. The initial symptoms appear as minor skin irritations that might be dismissed as allergic reactions or minor infections, allowing the disease to establish itself before victims seek medical attention. The characteristic pox marks begin to appear after several weeks of infection, starting as small discolored patches that gradually expand and develop into raised lesions with distinctive patterns that vary between individuals. The psychological effects of the walking pox often prove more devastating than its physical symptoms, as the visible nature of the disease creates social stigma that isolates victims from their communities and support networks. The progressive nature of the skin lesions means that victims must watch their appearance deteriorate over time, creating anxiety and depression that can be more debilitating than the physical discomfort caused by the disease itself. The knowledge that the condition is incurable and will continue to worsen creates despair that makes victims susceptible to the philosophical messages promoted by Nurgle's cults. The social disruption caused by walking pox outbreaks extends beyond the immediate impact on infected individuals to affect entire communities through fear and discrimination. The visible nature of the disease creates panic among uninfected populations who may resort to violence or exile to remove perceived threats from their midst. These reactions often target individuals who are suspected of infection, but who may not actually carry the disease, creating additional social tensions that weaken community cohesion and imperial authority. The creeping rot represents a more recent addition to Nurgle's arsenal of biological weapons, first appearing during the later years of the 41st millennium in response to improved imperial medical countermeasures that had proven effective against earlier plague strains. This disease demonstrates the adaptive capabilities that characterize Nurgle's most sophisticated contagions, as it appears to have been specifically designed to overcome the protective equipment and treatment protocols that had been developed to combat other supernatural diseases. The creeping rot's ability to affect both organic and inorganic materials makes it particularly dangerous in the high-technology environments that characterize imperial military and administrative facilities. The unique characteristics of the creeping rot include its ability to consume and corrupt metal, ceramite, and other synthetic materials that are normally immune to biological attack. The disease appears to operate through the production of exotic enzymes that can break down the molecular bonds that hold these materials together, reducing sophisticated equipment to useless sludge within hours of exposure. This capability makes the creeping rot particularly effective against imperial forces that rely heavily on advanced technology and protective equipment for their operational effectiveness. The transmission mechanisms employed by the creeping rot demonstrate remarkable sophistication, as the disease can spread through electromagnetic fields, data networks, and even psychic connections that link individuals within military command structures. The ability to propagate through non-biological vectors makes traditional quarantine procedures ineffective, as the disease can bypass physical barriers and contaminate areas that should be completely isolated from infected zones. The electronic transmission capability means that the disease can spread through Vox networks, cogitator systems, and other communication devices that are essential for coordinating military responses. The adaptive evolution that characterizes Nurgle's plagues in the 41st millennium reflects the Plague Father's patient approach to biological warfare, as each new strain incorporates lessons learned from previous outbreaks and imperial countermeasures. The diseases that emerge from the Garden of Nurgle demonstrate increasing sophistication in their ability to overcome specific defensive measures, suggesting that they are being deliberately modified in response to intelligence gathered from previous encounters. This evolutionary pressure creates an arms race between imperial medical science and chaos biological warfare that favors the forces of corruption due to their supernatural advantages and unlimited experimental resources. The genetic analysis of captured plague samples reveals evidence of deliberate modification that goes beyond natural evolutionary processes, with disease organisms showing characteristics that could not have developed through random mutation alone. The incorporation of warp-touched materials into the genetic structure of these pathogens provides them with capabilities that transcend the limitations of purely biological systems, allowing them to affect targets and environments that should be immune to conventional disease. The presence of these supernatural elements makes it extremely difficult for imperial scientists to develop effective countermeasures using conventional research methods. The resistance mechanisms developed by Nurgle's plagues demonstrate their ability to anticipate and counter imperial medical responses before those responses can be fully implemented. Diseases that initially appear vulnerable to specific treatments often develop immunity to those same treatments within days or weeks of their first application, suggesting that the pathogens possess some form of collective intelligence or communication system that allows them to share adaptive information. This rapid adaptation capability makes it virtually impossible for imperial medical personnel to develop lasting solutions to plague outbreaks. The environmental adaptation displayed by modern plague strains allows them to survive and thrive in conditions that would be lethal to natural pathogens, including the vacuum of space, extreme temperatures, and high radiation environments. This environmental resilience means that standard sterilization procedures are ineffective against these diseases, while their ability to survive in space allows them to spread between worlds through normal shipping and travel without requiring living hosts. The combination of environmental stability and supernatural transmission capabilities makes these plagues extremely difficult to contain once they escape their initial outbreak sites. The role of the Adeptus Mechanicus biologists in combating Nurgle's contagions represents one of the most specialized and dangerous assignments within the broader Mechanicus hierarchy, requiring individuals who possess both extensive knowledge of biological systems and the mental fortitude necessary to study diseases that can corrupt both flesh and machine. The biologists adepts who volunteer for this work undergo extensive modification that includes the replacement of vulnerable organic systems with mechanical alternatives, though even these precautions provide only limited protection against the most sophisticated plague strains. The research facilities operated by the biologists for studying chaos contagions must be constructed according to specifications that account for the supernatural nature of their subjects, incorporating both physical containment measures and psychic shielding that can prevent the spread of corruption through non-material vectors. These laboratories typically feature multiple layers of isolation barriers, automated defense systems that can eliminate contaminated personnel, and emergency destruction protocols that can sterilize entire facilities if containment is breached. The extreme nature of these precautions reflects the genuine danger posed by the diseases being studied. The analytical techniques employed by biologist researchers combine traditional scientific methods with specialized equipment that can detect and measure supernatural influences within biological samples. The augmented sensory capabilities of biologists, adepts allow them to perceive aspects of disease organisms that would be invisible to normal human observation, while their mechanical components provide some protection against the corrupting influence of the specimens they study. The data gathered through these investigations provides valuable intelligence about the capabilities and limitations of specific plague strains. The countermeasures developed by the biologists demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of imperial science when confronting supernatural threats. The most successful treatments typically involve the use of blessed oils, sanctified chemicals, and other materials that have been prepared according to religious protocols that provide some protection against warp-based corruption. However, the effectiveness of these countermeasures varies significantly depending on the specific characteristics of each plague strain and the spiritual purity of the individuals administering the treatments. The Ordo Malleus maintains specialized teams of inquisitors and support personnel who work closely with the biologists to investigate and combat plague outbreaks that show signs of chaos involvement. These investigations require individuals who possess both the technical knowledge necessary to understand complex biological systems and the spiritual strength needed to resist corruption during extended exposure to contaminated environments. The collaboration between inquisitorial and mechanicus personnel creates opportunities for sharing resources and expertise that can improve the effectiveness of imperial responses to plague outbreaks. The quarantine protocols developed for containing supernatural plague outbreaks incorporate both physical isolation measures and spiritual purification procedures that address the multi-dimensional nature of chaos corruption. The most effective quarantine zones feature multiple layers of containment that include physical barriers, psychic wards, and blessed ground that has been consecrated according to imperial religious practices. The maintenance of these quarantine zones requires constant vigilance and regular renewal of protective measures to prevent the gradual degradation of containment systems. The military forces assigned to enforce quarantine zones during plague outbreaks receive specialized training and equipment that prepares them for the unique challenges of fighting enemies that may be immune to conventional weapons and tactics. The standard equipment issued to these forces includes flamers, melta-weapons, and other systems that can achieve complete destruction of contaminated targets rather than simply inflicting damage. The psychological preparation of quarantine enforcement personnel includes extensive indoctrination designed to help them maintain discipline and effectiveness when confronting enemies that challenge fundamental assumptions about life and death. The 13th Black Crusade marked a turning point in galactic history that would see Nurgle's influence reach unprecedented heights across the Imperium. As Abaddon the Despoiler marshaled the largest chaos force since the Horus Heresy, the Plague Father's servants played a crucial role in the campaign's initial successes, their patient methods of warfare proving ideally suited to the prolonged siege operations that characterized the assault on Cadia. The Death Guard's participation in the Crusade demonstrated their evolution from a single legion into a galaxy-spanning network of plague companies, each one capable of independent operations while contributing to the broader strategic objectives established by Mortarion and his most trusted champions. The preliminary phase of the 13th Black Crusade saw Death Guard forces establishing forward operating bases on worlds throughout the Cadian Gate, their ability to operate in contaminated environments allowing them to occupy planets that other chaos forces found uninhabitable. These installations served multiple purposes beyond simple military staging areas, functioning as laboratories where new plague strains could be developed specifically for use against the heavily fortified Imperial positions that guarded the approach to Terra. The systematic contamination of these worlds created buffer zones that complicated Imperial supply lines while providing the Death Guard with defensible positions from which to launch their own offensive operations. The Siege of Cadia itself revealed the full extent of Nurgle's contribution to the Black Crusade, as Death Guard forces deployed biological weapons that had been specifically designed to overcome the fortress world's defensive systems. The planet's sealed atmospheric processors and underground bunker networks, originally constructed to protect the population from conventional orbital bombardment, became death traps when contaminated with airborne pathogens that could survive in recycled air systems. The gradual degradation of Cadia's life support infrastructure forced Imperial defenders to choose between maintaining their sealed positions and risking exposure to the toxic atmosphere that the Death Guard had created around their strongholds. The psychological impact of the Death Guard's presence on Cadia extended far beyond the immediate effects of their biological weapons, as Imperial forces found themselves fighting enemies whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death. The sight of bloated, diseased space marines advancing steadily through artillery barrages that should have obliterated them created a form of existential terror that conventional military training could not address. The knowledge that wounds inflicted by Death Guard weapons carried diseases that could spread throughout entire regiments created additional pressure on Imperial medical services that were already overwhelmed by the scale of the conflict. The role of Typhus during the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated his evolution from a Death Guard captain into an independent agent of Nurgle's will, as his operations extended far beyond the immediate objectives of Abaddon's campaign. The Herald of Nurgle coordinated plague outbreaks across dozens of worlds simultaneously, creating a network of infected systems that would continue to serve Nurgle's purposes long after the Black Crusade had ended. His ability to travel independently through the warp allowed him to establish connections between isolated Death Guard forces and to coordinate their activities according to strategic plans that encompassed objectives spanning multiple sectors. The destroyer hive that accompanied Typhus had evolved significantly since his transformation during the Horus Heresy, incorporating new organisms that had been developed specifically for use against the advanced defensive systems employed by 41st Millennium Imperial forces. The swarm included bacteria that could consume the blessed oils used to maintain Imperial weapons and equipment, while viral agents were designed to corrupt the machine spirits that animated advanced technological systems. The integration of these different biological weapons created a comprehensive assault system that could degrade enemy capabilities across multiple categories simultaneously. The culmination of the 13th Black Crusade with the destruction of Cadia created opportunities for Nurgle's influence to spread throughout the galaxy in ways that had been impossible during the previous 10 millennia. The opening of the Great Rift fractured the Imperium's communication and transportation networks, creating isolated regions where Imperial authority could not be effectively maintained. These areas of reduced Imperial control provided ideal conditions for plague cults to establish themselves, and for Death Guard forces to operate without the coordinated resistance that had previously limited their effectiveness. The Great Rift itself became a conduit for Nurgle's influence, as the massive warp storm carried spores and disease organisms across vast distances while creating environmental conditions that favored the spread of supernatural contagions. Worlds that had never experienced direct contact with Chaos forces found themselves dealing with plague outbreaks that appeared spontaneously in their populations, while the psychic turbulence created by the rift made it difficult for Imperial authorities to distinguish between natural disasters and supernatural attacks. The resulting confusion and panic created additional opportunities for Nurgle's servants to exploit weakened Imperial defenses. The plague wars that erupted in Ultramar following the Great Rift's opening represented the most significant military campaign undertaken by Nurgle's forces since the Horus Heresy, as Mortarion led a massive invasion force against one of the Imperium's most strategically important regions. The choice of Ultramar as a target reflected both strategic considerations and personal motivations, as the demon Primarch sought to prove his superiority over his loyalist brother Robute Guilliman, while simultaneously striking at the heart of imperial military doctrine. The methodical nature of the campaign demonstrated the Death Guard's evolution from a single legion into a sophisticated military organization capable of coordinating complex multi-system operations. The initial phase of the Plague Wars saw Death Guard forces establishing beachheads on worlds throughout the Ultramar system, their approach emphasizing the gradual contamination of target planets rather than immediate conquest through direct assault. The systematic introduction of various plague strains created environmental conditions that favored the attackers while making it increasingly difficult for Imperial forces to maintain their equipment and personnel in operational condition. The patient nature of this approach reflected Nurgle's philosophy while also serving practical military purposes by weakening enemy defenses before major engagements began. The assault on Ajax, one of Ultramar's garden worlds, demonstrated the Death Guard's ability to corrupt even the most pristine Imperial environments through the application of carefully selected biological weapons. The planet's extensive agricultural systems, originally designed to feed the populations of multiple worlds, became vectors for disease transmission as contaminated crops spread plague organisms throughout the local food supply. The transformation of Ajax from a productive agricultural world into a diseased wasteland served both tactical and symbolic purposes, showing the futility of Imperial attempts to maintain order in the face of Nurgle's inevitable corruption. The Siege of Parmenio revealed the Death Guard's adaptation to fighting against Space Marine opponents, as their tactics had evolved to account for the enhanced resilience and advanced equipment that characterized Adeptus Astartes forces. The biological weapons deployed during this campaign included organisms specifically designed to penetrate power armor seals and to corrupt the various life support systems that allowed Space Marines to operate in hazardous environments. The prolonged nature of the siege allowed these weapons to gradually degrade the effectiveness of defending forces while creating conditions that favored the Death Guard's own enhanced constitution. Mortarian's personal involvement in the Plague Wars demonstrated his growth as a military commander since his transformation into a demon Primarch, as his strategic planning incorporated lessons learned from 10 millennia of warfare against Imperial forces. His ability to coordinate the activities of multiple Death Guard companies across different worlds while maintaining overall strategic coherence showed the organizational capabilities that had been enhanced by his demonic nature. The Primarch's presence on the battlefield provided both tactical advantages and psychological impact that helped to maintain the morale and effectiveness of his forces during the prolonged campaign. The Scourge Stars campaign that preceded the main assault on Ultramar created a network of corrupted systems that served as staging areas and supply bases for the Death Guard's operations. The systematic contamination of these worlds involved the deployment of self-replicating plague organisms that could maintain themselves without ongoing support from their creators, creating permanent zones of corruption that would continue to serve Nurgle's purposes regardless of the campaign's ultimate outcome. The establishment of these corrupted regions demonstrated the Death Guard's long-term strategic thinking and their commitment to creating lasting changes in the galaxy's balance of power. The Siege of Vrax stands as one of the most significant conflicts involving Nurgle's forces prior to the 13th Black Crusade, representing a campaign that demonstrated both the potential and limitations of plague warfare when applied to heavily fortified Imperial positions. The 18-year duration of the siege provided opportunities for extensive experimentation with different biological weapons and tactical approaches, as Death Guard forces adapted their methods to overcome the specific defensive measures employed by the Fortress World's garrison. The prolonged nature of the conflict allowed for the gradual development of increasingly sophisticated plague strains that were tailored to counter specific Imperial countermeasures. The initial stages of the Vrax campaign saw Death Guard forces establishing positions in the planet's outer defensive rings, where they began the systematic contamination of the Fortress World's water supplies and atmospheric processors. The patient approach required for this type of warfare played to the Death Guard's strengths, while creating conditions that gradually degraded the effectiveness of the Imperial defenders. The introduction of airborne pathogens that could survive in the recycled atmosphere of sealed bunkers created particular challenges for Imperial forces who had relied on their fortifications to provide protection from external threats. The role of Necrosius the Undying during the Vrax campaign demonstrated the potential for individual Death Guard champions to achieve strategic objectives through the application of specialized knowledge and abilities. His expertise in the creation and deployment of undead servants provided the attacking forces with capabilities that complemented their existing biological warfare assets, creating combined arms formations that could exploit multiple enemy vulnerabilities simultaneously. The integration of necromantic techniques with conventional plague warfare created tactical possibilities that had not been fully explored in previous campaigns. The evolution of Imperial countermeasures during the Vrax siege forced Death Guard commanders to continuously adapt their biological weapons and tactical approaches to maintain their effectiveness against increasingly sophisticated defensive systems. The development of new plague strains that could overcome specific Imperial medical treatments created an ongoing arms race that drove innovation on both sides of the conflict. The lessons learned during this prolonged engagement would later prove valuable during the larger campaigns that followed the opening of the Great Rift. The Badab War, while not primarily a Death Guard operation, saw significant involvement from Nurgle's mortal servants who exploited the conflict's chaos to establish cult networks throughout the Maelstrom region. The breakdown of Imperial authority during the war created opportunities for plague cults to operate openly while providing support to the various rebel factions involved in the conflict. The establishment of these cult networks created lasting infrastructure that would continue to serve Nurgle's purposes long after the war's official conclusion. The Macharian Crusade's aftermath provided additional opportunities for Nurgle's influence to spread throughout the galaxy, as the massive military campaign's conclusion left numerous worlds with weakened defenses and disrupted governmental structures. The demobilization of Imperial Guard regiments created populations of displaced veterans who were susceptible to cult recruitment, while the economic disruption caused by the campaign's end created social conditions that favored the spread of disease and despair. The systematic exploitation of these conditions by Nurgle's servants demonstrated their ability to capitalize on Imperial military successes as effectively as they could exploit defeats. The ongoing struggle between Nurgle's expansion and Imperial resistance has created a complex pattern of advance and retreat that spans multiple sectors and encompasses conflicts ranging from individual cult uprisings to full-scale invasions by Death Guard forces. The decentralized nature of Nurgle's operations allows his servants to maintain pressure on Imperial forces across a vast front while concentrating their efforts in areas where conditions are most favorable for their success. This approach creates a strategic situation where Imperial authorities must constantly respond to threats that can emerge anywhere in the galaxy, while lacking the resources to maintain effective defenses everywhere simultaneously. The adaptation of Imperial military doctrine to address the unique challenges posed by Nurgle's forces has resulted in the development of specialized units and equipment designed specifically for biological warfare scenarios. The creation of dedicated quarantine enforcement formations within the Imperial Guard reflects the recognition that conventional military tactics are insufficient for dealing with enemies who can corrupt both personnel and equipment through mere proximity. The training and equipment provided to these specialized units represents a significant investment of Imperial resources that must be balanced against other military priorities. The role of the Adeptus Sororitas in combating Nurgle's influence has become increasingly important as the threat posed by plague cults and Death Guard forces has grown throughout the 41st millennium. The Sisters of Battle's combination of military effectiveness and spiritual purity makes them particularly well-suited for operations against enemies who can corrupt both flesh and soul through supernatural means. The development of specialized tactics and equipment for use against biological threats has become a priority for several orders militant, with the Order of the Cleansing Flame becoming particularly renowned for their expertise in this area. The coordination between different imperial organizations in responding to Nurgle's threats requires complex command structures that can integrate the capabilities of the Astra Militarum, Adeptus Astartes, Adeptus Mechanicus, and Inquisition, while maintaining the operational security necessary to prevent corruption from spreading through command networks. The development of these coordination mechanisms has been complicated by the need to balance operational effectiveness against the risk of creating communication channels that could be exploited by enemy forces. The resulting command structures often emphasize compartmentalization and redundancy at the expense of operational efficiency. The long-term strategic implications of Nurgle's expanding influence extend beyond immediate military concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the Imperium's ability to maintain its territorial integrity and governmental authority. The patient nature of Nurgle's approach to corruption means that his influence can establish itself in regions that appear to be under Imperial control while remaining dormant until conditions become favorable for open rebellion. This creates a situation where Imperial authorities must constantly monitor their own populations for signs of corruption while maintaining the military forces necessary to respond to external threats. The economic impact of Nurgle's campaigns extends far beyond the immediate costs of military operations to encompass the broader disruption of trade networks and industrial production that results from plague outbreaks and quarantine measures. The contamination of agricultural worlds can create food shortages that affect multiple systems, while the corruption of industrial facilities can disrupt the production of essential military equipment and supplies. The cumulative effect of these disruptions creates economic vulnerabilities that can be exploited by other enemies of the Imperium while reducing the resources available for military operations. The psychological effects of prolonged exposure to Nurgle's influence create challenges for Imperial military forces that extend beyond the immediate tactical problems posed by biological weapons and corrupted enemies. The knowledge that exposure to enemy forces can result in corruption that affects both body and soul creates stress and anxiety that can degrade unit effectiveness even when no actual infection has occurred. The development of psychological support systems and spiritual guidance programs has become an essential component of military operations in regions where Nurgle's influence is particularly strong. The eternal struggle between Nurgle and Tzeentch represents one of the most fundamental conflicts within the realm of chaos, embodying the philosophical opposition between stagnation and change that defines their respective approaches to existence. This rivalry extends far beyond simple territorial disputes or competition for mortal followers, encompassing a fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality itself and the proper direction of cosmic evolution. Where Nurgle seeks to preserve and perfect existing forms through the acceptance of decay and entropy, Tzeentch pursues constant transformation and mutation that destroys established patterns in favor of endless possibility and change. The manifestation of this conflict within the warp creates zones of contested reality where the domains of both gods overlap and clash in ways that defy conventional understanding of space and time. These border regions exist in states of constant flux, with areas of Nurgle's garden being consumed by crystalline growths that shift and change according to Tzeentch's will, while sections of the Changer's maze become clogged with organic matter that resists alteration and mutation. The battles fought in these liminal spaces involve not just the physical forces of both gods, but the fundamental principles they represent, creating conflicts where victory is measured in philosophical terms rather than simple territorial control. The servants of both gods demonstrate this philosophical opposition through their contrasting approaches to achieving their master's objectives. Nurgle's followers embrace patience and methodical planning, allowing their diseases and corruption to spread gradually through target populations, while accepting setbacks as temporary obstacles that will eventually be overcome through persistence. Tzeentch's servants pursue rapid transformation and dramatic change, seeking to achieve their goals through complex schemes that exploit unexpected opportunities and create cascading effects that reshape entire regions of space. These different methodologies create natural friction when the two factions encounter each other, as each side views the other's approach as fundamentally flawed and counterproductive. The competition between Nurgle and Tzeentch for influence over mortal populations reveals the deeper nature of their rivalry, as each god seeks to convert potential followers through completely different appeals and promises. Nurgle offers relief from suffering through acceptance and the promise of community among fellow sufferers, creating stable cult organizations that can maintain themselves over long periods while gradually expanding their influence. Tzeentch promises power and transformation through knowledge and ambition, attracting followers who seek to transcend their current limitations through dramatic personal change. The fundamental incompatibility between these approaches means that individuals who are drawn to one god's message are typically immune to the other's appeals. The strategic implications of this rivalry extend throughout the galaxy, as the conflict between stagnation and change affects every aspect of the ongoing war between chaos and the Imperium. Nurgle's methodical approach to corruption creates lasting changes that can persist for millennia, establishing infected regions that serve as permanent bases for future operations. Tzeentch's emphasis on transformation and mutation creates dramatic short-term effects that can reshape entire sectors, but which may prove unstable over longer time periods. The interaction between these different approaches creates complex strategic situations where the actions of one god's servants can either support or undermine the efforts of the other. The theological debates that occur among chaos scholars and cultists regarding the proper relationship between decay and change reflect the broader philosophical implications of this rivalry. Some heretical texts suggest that Nurgle and Tzeentch represent complementary aspects of a single cosmic principle, with decay serving as the necessary precondition for transformation and change, creating the conditions that eventually lead to stagnation. Other interpretations emphasize the irreconcilable nature of their opposition, arguing that the conflict between them represents a fundamental flaw in the structure of reality that prevents the achievement of true cosmic harmony. The Imperium of Man represents Nurgle's most significant and persistent enemy, embodying everything that the Plague Father seeks to corrupt and transform through his gifts of disease and decay. The vast bureaucratic structure of imperial government, with its emphasis on maintaining established procedures and resisting change, creates exactly the type of stagnant system that Nurgle finds both contemptible and vulnerable to his influence. The Imperium's desperate attempts to preserve the status quo in the face of constant external threats create conditions of stress and despair that make imperial populations particularly susceptible to the philosophical messages promoted by Nurgle's cults. The Adeptus Astartes' response to Nurgle's influence demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of the Space Marine chapters when confronting enemies who can corrupt both flesh and spirit through supernatural means. The enhanced physiology that makes Space Marines resistant to conventional diseases provides only limited protection against the warp-touched contagions that serve as Nurgle's primary weapons, while their psychological conditioning can be overwhelmed by the existential horror of facing enemies who challenge fundamental assumptions about life and death. The development of specialized tactics and equipment for use against plague-bearing enemies has become a priority for many chapters, particularly those operating in regions where Nurgle's influence is particularly strong. The Ultramarines' experience during the Plague Wars revealed the challenges that even the most disciplined and well-equipped Space Marine forces face when confronting Death Guard opponents, who possess both superior knowledge of biological warfare and supernatural resilience that allows them to survive damage that would destroy normal enemies. The methodical nature of Death Guard attacks, which emphasized the gradual degradation of enemy capabilities rather than dramatic tactical victories, proved particularly challenging for Space Marine commanders who had been trained to achieve decisive results through aggressive action. The prolonged nature of these campaigns created logistical and psychological pressures that tested the limits of space marine endurance while providing Death Guard forces with opportunities to deploy increasingly sophisticated biological weapons. The Imperial Fist's defense of Terra during various siege operations has provided valuable insights into the most effective methods for combating Nurgle's forces in urban environments, where the close quarters and dense populations create ideal conditions for disease transmission. The chapter's expertise in siege warfare and defensive operations has been adapted to address the unique challenges posed by enemies who can corrupt both personnel and equipment through mere proximity. The development of specialized defensive positions that incorporate both physical barriers and spiritual purification systems has become a key component of Imperial Fist doctrine when preparing for potential plague-related threats. The Astra Militarum's response to Nurgle's influence reflects the broader challenges faced by Imperial military forces when dealing with enemies who can exploit the very weaknesses that make human soldiers effective in conventional warfare. The close unit cohesion that allows Imperial Guard formations to maintain discipline under fire becomes a liability when facing enemies who can spread corruption through social bonds and shared experiences. The standardized equipment and procedures that enable large-scale military operations create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by diseases designed to target specific types of gear or tactical doctrines. The Cadian shock troops' experience during the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated both the potential and limitations of conventional Imperial Guard tactics when applied against Death Guard opponents. The disciplined fire control and coordinated maneuvers that had made Cadian forces effective against other enemies proved inadequate against opponents who could absorb tremendous amounts of damage while continuing to advance. The psychological impact of watching apparently dead enemies continue to fight created stress reactions that degraded unit effectiveness even when no actual corruption had occurred. The adaptation of Cadian tactics to emphasize complete destruction of enemy forces rather than simple tactical defeat required significant changes in training and equipment that could not be implemented quickly enough to affect the campaign's outcome. The Krieg Death Corps' unique culture and tactical doctrine have proven surprisingly effective against Nurgle's forces, as their acceptance of death and suffering creates psychological resilience that makes them less susceptible to the despair and corruption that typically accompany prolonged exposure to plague-bearing enemies. The Death Corps' emphasis on attrition warfare and their willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives align well with the requirements for fighting enemies who must be completely destroyed rather than simply defeated. The sealed environment suits that Death Corps troops wear as standard equipment provide additional protection against airborne pathogens, while their chemical warfare training gives them experience with the types of hazardous environments that Death Guard forces typically create. The Catachan jungle fighters' expertise in operating in hostile environments has made them valuable assets for operations against Nurgle's forces, particularly in situations where conventional Imperial Guard formations would be overwhelmed by environmental hazards and biological threats. The natural resilience that comes from surviving on one of the galaxy's most dangerous worlds provides Catachan troops with enhanced resistance to many of the diseases and toxins employed by Death Guard forces. Their unconventional tactics and ability to operate independently in small units make them well suited for the type of guerrilla warfare that may be necessary when facing enemies who can corrupt large formations through proximity and contact. The Adeptus Sororitas have emerged as one of the most effective Imperial forces for combating Nurgle's influence, as their combination of military training, spiritual purity, and access to specialized equipment makes them uniquely qualified to fight enemies who threaten both body and soul. The Sisters of Battle's faith-based powers provide protection against the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to corruption, while their flamers and other purification weapons can achieve the complete destruction of contaminated targets that conventional weapons cannot accomplish. The development of specialized tactics and equipment for use against plague-bearing enemies has become a particular focus for several orders militant. The Order of the Cleansing Flame has developed the most comprehensive doctrine for combating Nurgle's forces, incorporating both military tactics and spiritual practices that address the multidimensional nature of the threat posed by supernatural corruption. Their approach emphasizes the use of purifying flames not just as weapons, but as tools for cleansing contaminated areas and preventing the spread of infection through friendly forces. The Order's expertise in recognizing the early signs of corruption has made them valuable consultants for other imperial organizations dealing with potential plague outbreaks. The Order of the Bloody Rose's aggressive combat doctrine has been adapted to address the unique challenges posed by enemies who can survive damage that would destroy normal opponents while corrupting those who come into contact with them. Their emphasis on rapid, decisive action helps to minimize the exposure time that allows corruption to take hold, while their superior training and equipment provide the capabilities necessary to achieve complete destruction of enemy forces. The Order's experience in urban warfare has proven particularly valuable in situations where Nurgle's forces have established themselves within imperial population centers. The Adeptus Mechanicus response to Nurgle's influence reflects the unique vulnerabilities and capabilities of the tech priests when confronting enemies who can corrupt both flesh and machine through supernatural means. The extensive cybernetic modifications that characterize senior Mechanicus personnel provide some protection against biological threats, while their understanding of advanced technology allows them to develop countermeasures that purely biological imperial forces cannot create. However, the discovery that Nurgle's influence can affect machine spirits and technological systems has created new categories of threat that require specialized responses. The Forge world of Lucius has developed some of the most sophisticated countermeasures against Nurgle's corruption, incorporating both technological solutions and religious practices that address the spiritual aspects of the threat. Their research into the nature of machine spirit corruption has revealed the complex ways that chaos influence can affect technological systems, while their development of blessed oils and sanctified components provides practical tools for protecting essential equipment. The collaboration between Lucius tech priests and other imperial organizations has created opportunities for sharing knowledge and resources that improve the overall effectiveness of anti-Nurgle operations. The tensions between Nurgle and Khorne represent a fundamental clash between methodical patience and explosive violence that creates ongoing friction within the broader Chaos Alliance. Khorne's emphasis on immediate, decisive action through direct combat conflicts, with Nurgle's preference for gradual corruption and patient cultivation of disease. The Blood God's followers view the Death Guard's methodical approach to warfare as cowardly and indirect, while Nurgle's servants consider Khornate tactics to be wasteful and ultimately counterproductive. These philosophical differences create practical problems when forces of both gods must cooperate in joint operations against imperial targets. The competition between Nurgle and Khorne for influence over mortal populations reveals the different appeals that each god offers to potential followers. Khorne attracts individuals who seek to express their anger and frustration through violence and conquest, promising immediate satisfaction through the destruction of enemies and the achievement of personal glory in battle. Nurgle appeals to those who have been worn down by suffering and hardship, offering acceptance and community among fellow sufferers while promising relief from the pain of existence. The fundamental incompatibility between these approaches means that individuals who are drawn to one god's message are typically immune to the other's appeals. The relationship between Nurgle and Slaanesh demonstrates the complex dynamics that exist between chaos gods whose spheres of influence overlap in unexpected ways. Both gods are concerned with physical sensation and the corruption of mortal flesh, but their approaches to these shared interests differ dramatically in both method and ultimate objective. Slaanesh seeks to intensify and amplify all forms of sensation, pushing mortals toward ever greater extremes of experience in pursuit of perfect pleasure and pain. Nurgle offers the opposite approach, promising relief from sensation through the acceptance of numbness and decay that comes with advanced disease and corruption. The philosophical opposition between excess and acceptance creates natural friction between the followers of these gods, as each side views the other's approach as fundamentally flawed and counterproductive. Slaanesh's servants pursue constant stimulation and new experiences, seeking to transcend their current limitations through the exploration of forbidden pleasures and sensations. Nurgle's followers embrace contentment and satisfaction with their current state, finding peace through the acceptance of their afflictions and the community that comes from shared suffering. These different approaches to existence create conflicts that can erupt into open warfare when the two factions encounter each other. The competition between Nurgle and Slaanesh for influence over specific populations often centers on individuals who are dealing with physical or emotional pain that could be addressed through either god's gifts. Slaanesh offers to transform pain into pleasure through the exploration of new sensations and experiences, while Nurgle promises to eliminate pain through the acceptance of numbness and decay. The choice between these alternatives often depends on the individual's personality and circumstances, with those who retain hope for improvement being drawn to Slaanesh, while those who have lost hope finding comfort in Nurgle's message of acceptance. The strategic implications of these rivalries extend throughout the galaxy, affecting every aspect of the ongoing war between Chaos and the Imperium. The competition between different Chaos gods for influence over mortal populations creates opportunities for Imperial forces to exploit divisions within enemy ranks, while the philosophical differences between various Chaos factions can be used to turn them against each other. However, the unpredictable nature of these rivalries means that temporary alliances between former enemies can emerge suddenly, creating new threats that Imperial commanders must be prepared to address. The Imperial strategy for dealing with these rivalries involves both direct military action against Chaos forces and more subtle approaches that seek to exploit the divisions between different factions. The Inquisition maintains extensive intelligence networks that monitor the activities of various Chaos cults and demon legions, looking for opportunities to manipulate their conflicts in ways that serve Imperial interests. The success of these operations depends on accurate intelligence about the motivations and capabilities of different Chaos factions, while avoiding the corruption that can result from too much exposure to heretical knowledge. The Plague Planet stands as Mortarian's greatest achievement since his transformation into a demon Primarch, representing the culmination of 10 millennia of accumulated knowledge about the cultivation and weaponization of disease. Located deep within the Eye of Terror, this world serves as both fortress and laboratory, where the Death Guard's Primarch has created an environment that perfectly embodies Nurgle's philosophy of decay and renewal. The planet's surface bears no resemblance to its original form, having been completely transformed through the application of exotic plagues and biological engineering that operates according to principles that transcend conventional understanding of terraforming technology. The atmospheric composition of the Plague Planet consists of a complex mixture of gases that would be instantly lethal to unprotected humans, yet which provides the perfect environment for the countless disease organisms that inhabit every cubic meter of the world's biosphere. The air itself thrums with microscopic life forms that exist in constant states of reproduction and mutation, creating an evolutionary pressure cooker that generates new plague strains at an unprecedented rate. The density of these airborne organisms creates a visible haze that gives the planet's atmosphere a greenish tint, while the constant chemical reactions between different biological agents produce aurora-like displays that illuminate the perpetually overcast sky. The geography of the Plague Planet reflects the organic nature of its transformation, with mountain ranges that pulse like living organs and valleys that channel streams of infectious fluid between different regions of the world. The continental masses appear to breathe with slow, rhythmic movements that suggest the presence of vast underground organisms whose bodies have become integrated with the planet's geological structure. These movements create seismic activity that follows biological rather than geological patterns, with earthquakes occurring in cycles that correspond to the reproductive phases of the planet's largest parasitic inhabitants. The fortress cities that dot the planet's surface represent architectural achievements that blend Gothic imperial design with organic growth patterns that reflect Nurgle's influence. These structures appear to have been grown rather than built, with walls that consist of living bone and cartilage that can heal damage automatically while providing defensive capabilities that exceed those of conventional fortifications. The buildings within these cities pulse with the same rhythmic breathing that characterizes the planet's geological features, creating environments that feel alive and responsive to the needs of their inhabitants. The central fortress that serves as Mortarian's primary residence towers above the surrounding landscape like a diseased cathedral, its spires reaching into the toxic atmosphere while its foundations extend deep into the planet's corrupted core. The structure's exterior walls weep constant streams of infectious fluid that pool in moats around the fortress's perimeter, creating defensive barriers that can incapacitate attackers through mere proximity. The various towers and outbuildings that surround the main structure serve specialized functions related to disease research and plague cultivation, with each building designed to optimize specific aspects of biological warfare development. The interior of Mortarian's fortress reflects the Primarch's dual nature as both military commander and scientific researcher, with chambers that serve as both strategic planning centers and advanced laboratories. The walls of these rooms are lined with organic computing systems that process vast amounts of data about disease progression and transmission patterns, while the floors consist of living tissue that can sample and analyze any biological material that comes into contact with it. The integration of these analytical capabilities with the fortress's defensive systems creates a structure that can adapt its protection protocols based on real-time assessment of potential threats. The demon weapons that serve Nurgle's champions represent the pinnacle of corruption-forged armaments, combining the reliability of traditional weaponry with the adaptive capabilities of living organisms. These weapons demonstrate characteristics that transcend the limitations of purely mechanical systems, growing and evolving in response to their wielder's needs, while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for effective combat use. The creation process for these weapons involves the careful integration of demonic essence with specially prepared metals and organic components, resulting in hybrid systems that embody both technological sophistication and supernatural power. The plague swords wielded by Deathguard champions exemplify the principles that govern demon weapon creation, with blades that maintain razor-sharp edges while constantly weeping infectious fluids that can corrupt both organic and mechanical targets. These weapons demonstrate the ability to adapt their toxic payloads based on the specific vulnerabilities of their intended victims, with the demonic intelligence bound within each blade capable of analyzing enemy defenses and modifying its secretions accordingly. The hilts of these weapons typically incorporate living components that form symbiotic relationships with their wielders, providing enhanced grip and control while monitoring the user's physical condition and combat effectiveness. The forging process for plague swords requires the participation of greater demons who possess the knowledge and power necessary to bind demonic essence into physical form while maintaining the weapon's stability and effectiveness. The metals used in construction must be harvested from worlds that have been completely corrupted by Nurgle's influence, ensuring that the base material is already attuned to the Plague Father's power. The organic components are typically grown in specialized cultivation chambers, where they can be exposed to carefully controlled disease environments that prepare them for integration with the weapon's mechanical systems. The maintenance requirements for demon weapons differ significantly from those of conventional armaments, as these weapons require regular feeding with fresh biological material to maintain their effectiveness and prevent degradation. The symbiotic relationship between weapon and wielder means that the user's own bodily fluids serve as a primary source of nutrition, creating a bond that grows stronger over time as the weapon adapts to its owner's specific biological characteristics. The weapons also require periodic exposure to environments with high concentrations of disease organisms, allowing them to update their infectious capabilities and maintain their effectiveness against evolving enemy defenses. The corruption-spreading relics that serve as focuses for Nurgle's power represent artifacts whose origins often predate their current corrupted state, having been transformed through prolonged exposure to the Plaguefather's influence. These items demonstrate the ability of Nurgle's corruption to affect virtually any material or object, from ancient imperial relics to Xeno's technology that has been captured and repurposed for chaos use. The transformation process typically involves the gradual introduction of disease organisms that establish colonies within the artifact's structure, eventually achieving complete integration between the original object and its biological inhabitants. The Chalice of Corruption stands as one of the most notorious examples of a relic that has been completely transformed by Nurgle's influence, having evolved from a simple drinking vessel into a powerful artifact capable of contaminating entire water supplies with a single use. The chalice's interior surface has become lined with specialized bacteria that can survive in virtually any liquid environment while producing toxins that are specifically designed to overcome the purification systems used by Imperial forces. The vessel's exterior has developed a network of sensory organs that can detect the presence of potential targets and adjust the chalice's output accordingly. The Book of Rust represents another category of corruption, spreading relic, demonstrating Nurgle's ability to affect information and knowledge, as well as physical objects. This tome contains detailed instructions for creating and deploying various plague strains, but the text itself has become infected with organisms that can spread through contact with the pages. Readers who spend extended periods studying the book gradually develop symptoms that mirror the diseases described within its pages, creating a feedback loop that transforms scholars into living repositories of the knowledge they sought to acquire. The Tallyman's counting represents one of the most fundamental aspects of Nurgle's power structure, reflecting the Plaguefather's obsession with numerical precision and the sacred significance of specific numbers within his philosophical system. The counting process involves the continuous enumeration of every disease organism, infected individual, and act of decay that occurs throughout the galaxy, creating a comprehensive database that allows Nurgle to monitor the effectiveness of his various campaigns and to identify opportunities for expansion. The mathematical precision required for this task exceeds mortal capabilities, necessitating the use of demon servants whose mental faculties have been enhanced specifically for this purpose. The sacred number 7 holds particular significance within Nurgle's numerical system, appearing consistently throughout the organization of his forces and the structure of his domain. Death Guard formations typically consist of 7 companies, each containing 7 squads of 7 Marines, while the most potent plague strains require 7 different components that must be combined in specific ratios to achieve maximum effectiveness. The recurring appearance of this number in Nurgle's operations suggests that it possesses some form of mystical significance that enhances the power of activities conducted according to its principles. The counting rituals performed by Nurgle's servants follow complex mathematical patterns that incorporate both numerical precision and spiritual significance, creating ceremonies that serve both practical and religious purposes. These rituals typically involve the enumeration of specific categories of disease organisms or infected individuals, with the results being recorded in great ledgers that serve as both administrative documents and sacred texts. The mathematical relationships between different categories of counted items provide insights into the effectiveness of various plague strains and the optimal timing for new disease deployments. The influence of numerical significance on Nurgle's power manifests in measurable ways that affect the effectiveness of his servants and the potency of his plagues. Operations that are conducted according to the sacred mathematical principles demonstrate enhanced success rates compared to those that ignore these numerical relationships, while plague strains that incorporate the proper numerical ratios in their composition show increased virulence and resistance to imperial countermeasures. The mathematical precision required to achieve these effects necessitates constant monitoring and adjustment of ongoing operations to maintain optimal numerical relationships. The Great Calculation represents the ultimate expression of Nurgle's numerical obsession, encompassing a mathematical analysis of the entire galaxy's disease burden and the optimal distribution of plague resources to maximize corruption and suffering. This calculation requires the processing of vast amounts of data about population distributions, environmental conditions, and imperial defensive capabilities, creating computational requirements that exceed the capacity of any single demon or mortal servant. The collaborative nature of this calculation necessitates the coordination of counting activities across multiple demon legions and mortal cult organizations. The plague ships that serve as Nurgle's primary means of spreading his influence across the void represent some of the most horrifying vessels ever to traverse the galaxy's shipping lanes. These craft demonstrate the same organic integration of living and mechanical systems that characterizes other aspects of Nurgle's domain, with hulls that pulse with biological rhythms while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for interstellar travel. The transformation process that creates these vessels typically begins with the capture of conventional Imperial or Xenos ships, which are then gradually corrupted through the introduction of specially cultivated organisms that establish colonies throughout the vessel's structure. The atmospheric systems of plague ships have been completely redesigned to support the cultivation and distribution of airborne pathogens, with environmental controls that can maintain optimal conditions for different types of disease organisms simultaneously. The air recycling systems incorporate living filters that can process and concentrate infectious agents while removing waste products that might interfere with disease cultivation. The atmospheric composition within these vessels typically includes concentrations of disease organisms that would be instantly lethal to unprotected humans, yet which provide the perfect environment for the ship's corrupted crews. The cargo holds of plague ships serve as mobile laboratories and cultivation facilities where new disease strains can be developed during long voyages between target systems. These spaces contain specialized equipment for biological research and experimentation, including living analytical systems that can process samples and provide real-time feedback about the effectiveness of different plague variants. The controlled environments within these holds allow for the simultaneous cultivation of multiple disease strains under different conditions, creating opportunities for cross-contamination that can produce unexpected mutations and hybrid organisms. The weapon systems installed on plague ships reflect the integration of conventional naval armaments with biological warfare capabilities, creating hybrid systems that can deliver both kinetic and infectious payloads to enemy targets. The torpedo tubes have been modified to launch projectiles that contain concentrated disease organisms alongside conventional explosive warheads, while the gun batteries can fire shells that burst to release clouds of infectious spores over wide areas. The targeting systems incorporate biological sensors that can detect the presence of living targets and adjust weapon payloads accordingly. The navigation systems of plague ships demonstrate the same organic integration that characterizes other aspects of these vessels, with living components that can perceive warp currents and stellar positions through biological rather than mechanical means. These systems provide enhanced accuracy and reliability compared to conventional navigation equipment, while also allowing the ships to detect potential targets and avoid Imperial patrols through methods that transcend purely technological capabilities. The integration of biological navigation with conventional stellar cartography creates hybrid systems that can operate effectively in both normal space and the warp. The corrupted vehicles that serve Nurgle's ground forces represent the application of the same organic integration principles to terrestrial transportation and combat systems. These vehicles demonstrate the ability to operate in environments that would be lethal to conventional machinery, while providing enhanced capabilities that exceed those of their uncorrupted counterparts. The transformation process typically involves the gradual introduction of specialized organisms that establish symbiotic relationships with the vehicle's mechanical systems, eventually achieving complete integration between biological and technological components. The Rhino transports used by Death Guard forces have undergone extensive modification that reflects their new role as mobile disease distribution platforms. The passenger compartments have been equipped with atmospheric systems that can maintain optimal conditions for the cultivation of airborne pathogens while providing life support for the vehicle's occupants. The hull plating incorporates living components that can seal breaches automatically while secreting toxic substances that discourage enemy boarding attempts. The track systems have been enhanced with organic components that provide improved traction in contaminated environments while leaving trails of infectious material that can affect pursuing forces. The Predator tanks employed by Nurgle's forces demonstrate the integration of biological warfare capabilities with conventional armored fighting vehicle design, creating hybrid systems that can engage both conventional and supernatural enemies effectively. The main gun systems have been modified to fire shells that contain concentrated disease organisms alongside conventional explosive charges, while the secondary weapons can deploy clouds of infectious spores that create area denial effects. The armor plating incorporates living components that can repair damage automatically while providing enhanced protection against both kinetic and energy weapons. The Land Raiders used by elite Death Guard formations represent the pinnacle of corrupted vehicle technology, combining the transport capacity and firepower of conventional assault vehicles with biological warfare capabilities that make them effective against virtually any enemy force. The troop compartments have been equipped with specialized life support systems that can maintain optimal conditions for different types of disease organisms while providing enhanced protection for the vehicle's occupants. The weapon systems include both conventional armaments and biological warfare devices that can adapt their payloads based on the specific vulnerabilities of enemy targets. The maintenance requirements for corrupted vehicles differ significantly from those of conventional military equipment, as these systems require regular feeding with organic material to maintain their biological components. The symbiotic relationship between mechanical and biological systems means that the vehicles can perform many maintenance functions automatically, with living components capable of repairing damage and replacing worn parts without external intervention. However, the vehicles also require periodic exposure to environments with high concentrations of disease organisms to maintain the health of their biological systems and prevent degradation of their enhanced capabilities. The Chaos Dreadnoughts that serve within Nurgle's forces represent the ultimate fusion of corrupted technology with demonic essence, creating war machines that combine the firepower and resilience of conventional dreadnoughts with the adaptive capabilities of living organisms. These vehicles house the remains of fallen champions who have been granted a form of immortality through integration with demon-possessed machinery, creating entities that possess both mechanical durability and supernatural power. The sarcophagi that contain the pilot's remains have been modified to serve as cultivation chambers for various disease organisms, allowing the dreadnought to serve as both combat unit and mobile laboratory. The weapon systems mounted on Nurgle's dreadnoughts reflect the same integration of conventional and biological warfare capabilities that characterizes other corrupted vehicles, with armaments that can deliver both kinetic and infectious payloads to enemy targets. The close combat weapons incorporate living components that can inject toxins and disease organisms into enemy units while providing enhanced cutting and crushing capabilities. The ranged weapon systems can fire projectiles that contain concentrated plague organisms alongside conventional ammunition, creating hybrid effects that can overcome enemy defenses through multiple attack vectors simultaneously. The opening of the Great Rift in the closing years of the 41st millennium marked a fundamental shift in the cosmic balance that has elevated Nurgle's influence to unprecedented heights throughout the galaxy. This massive warp storm, stretching from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly, has created conditions that favor the Plague Father's methodical approach to corruption, while simultaneously weakening the Imperium's ability to maintain coordinated resistance against his expanding influence. The psychic turbulence generated by the rift has disrupted astropathic communications across vast regions of space, creating isolated pockets of Imperial territory where local authorities must face Nurgle's servants without the support and coordination that had previously enabled effective resistance. The environmental changes triggered by the Great Rift's formation have created ideal conditions for the spread of Nurgle's gifts throughout previously stable Imperial worlds. The warp storms that rage across the galaxy have deposited exotic spores and disease organisms on planets that had never experienced direct contact with chaos forces, while the psychic emanations from the rift have weakened the barriers between reality and the immaterium that normally contain supernatural contagions. Worlds that had maintained pristine environments for millennia now struggle with plague outbreaks that appear spontaneously in their populations, overwhelming local medical facilities and creating the despair and suffering that feed Nurgle's growing power. The Indomitus Crusade launched by Roboute Guilliman in response to the galactic crisis has inadvertently created additional opportunities for Nurgle's influence to spread throughout the Imperium. The massive military mobilization required for this campaign has strained Imperial logistics networks beyond their breaking points, creating shortages of medical supplies and sanitation equipment that make military formations vulnerable to disease outbreaks. The concentration of millions of soldiers in staging areas and transport vessels has created ideal conditions for the rapid transmission of infectious agents, while the stress and exhaustion of prolonged campaigning have weakened the immune systems of Imperial forces. The Plague Marines who have infiltrated Primaris Space Marine formations during the Indomitus Crusade demonstrate Nurgle's ability to corrupt even the most advanced Imperial military assets. These infiltrators, disguised through sophisticated biological camouflage that masks their true nature, have introduced diseases specifically designed to target the enhanced physiology of Primaris Marines. The infections they carry remain dormant during normal operations, but activate when the infected Marines are exposed to specific environmental triggers or combat stresses, creating sudden outbreaks that can cripple entire companies at critical moments. The Death Guard's response to the Indomitus Crusade has evolved beyond simple military opposition to encompass a comprehensive strategy of biological warfare that targets the campaign's logistical infrastructure. Mortarian's forces have systematically contaminated supply depots and manufacturing facilities throughout the Crusade's operational area, introducing diseases that can survive in stored materials for extended periods before activating when conditions become favorable. The corruption of ammunition stockpiles has created weapons that spread infection when fired, while contaminated rations have introduced slow-acting toxins that gradually weaken Imperial forces over time. The climate change that characterizes many Imperial worlds in the 41st millennium has created environmental conditions that strongly favor Nurgle's expansion throughout the galaxy. The industrial pollution generated by hive cities and manufacturing complexes has created toxic atmospheric conditions that serve as ideal breeding grounds for the exotic bacteria and viruses that carry the Plague Father's gifts. The deforestation and ecological destruction that accompanies Imperial expansion has eliminated natural biological systems that might have provided resistance to supernatural diseases, leaving sterile environments that can be easily colonized by Nurgle's organisms. The overpopulation crisis that affects the majority of Imperial worlds has created social conditions that make civilian populations particularly vulnerable to both disease transmission and the philosophical messages promoted by Nurgle's cults. The overcrowded living conditions in Hive City lower levels provide ideal environments for the rapid spread of infectious agents, while the competition for limited resources creates stress and despair that make individuals receptive to alternative explanations for their suffering. The breakdown of social services and medical care in these overpopulated regions has created vast populations of untreated sick who serve as reservoirs for disease organisms and potential recruits for plague cults. The water scarcity that plagues many Imperial worlds has forced populations to rely on contaminated sources that provide vectors for disease transmission, while creating the desperation that makes Nurgle's message of acceptance increasingly appealing. The industrial contamination of groundwater supplies has introduced chemical pollutants that weaken immune systems and create conditions favorable for exotic infections, while the breakdown of water treatment facilities has eliminated the purification systems that previously protected civilian populations from biological threats. The competition for clean water has created social tensions that can be exploited by cult recruiters who promise relief from suffering through acceptance of Nurgle's gifts. The food shortages that result from agricultural failures and supply chain disruptions have created malnutrition that weakens population immunity while forcing individuals to consume contaminated or spoiled food that serves as a vector for disease transmission. The desperation created by hunger makes populations willing to accept food from any source, including cult organizations that use contaminated supplies as recruitment tools. The breakdown of food safety systems has eliminated the quality controls that previously prevented the distribution of diseased products, creating opportunities for systematic contamination of food supplies across multiple worlds. The cyclical nature of Nurgle's influence operates on temporal scales that span millennia, with periods of apparent dormancy followed by explosive expansion that overwhelms imperial defenses before subsiding into new phases of gradual accumulation. The current period following the Great Rift's opening represents the beginning of what appears to be a major expansion phase, as the environmental and social conditions created by the galactic crisis provide ideal opportunities for the spread of Nurgle's corruption. The historical pattern suggests that this expansion will continue for several centuries before reaching a peak that will strain even Nurgle's vast resources, potentially creating opportunities for imperial counterattacks. The galactic strife that characterizes the 41st millennium has created a feedback loop that continuously strengthens Nurgle's position while weakening his enemy's ability to resist his influence. Each major conflict generates massive casualties and refugee populations that serve as ideal targets for plague cultivation, while the destruction of infrastructure and medical facilities eliminates the systems that might otherwise contain disease outbreaks. The psychological trauma created by constant warfare makes populations susceptible to the despair that feeds Nurgle's power, while the breakdown of social order creates opportunities for cult recruitment and organization. The Tyranid invasions that threaten the galaxy's eastern fringe have created unexpected opportunities for Nurgle's expansion, as the biological nature of these Xenos forces provides vectors for disease transmission that can affect both the invaders and the imperial populations they encounter. The consumption of infected biomass by Tyranid organisms has introduced Nurgle's diseases into the hive fleet's genetic material, creating hybrid organisms that combine Xenos' adaptability with chaos corruption. The terror generated by Tyranid attacks has created psychological conditions that make survivor populations particularly receptive to Nurgle's message of acceptance and community through shared suffering. The Orkwas that periodically sweep across imperial space have inadvertently served Nurgle's purposes by creating the environmental destruction and social chaos that favor the spread of his influence. The biological weapons employed by some Ork clans have introduced exotic diseases into imperial populations, while the destruction of medical facilities and sanitation systems has eliminated the infrastructure necessary for containing plague outbreaks. The post-war reconstruction efforts that follow Ork invasions often involve the resettlement of populations in temporary camps, where overcrowding and poor sanitation create ideal conditions for disease transmission. The Imperium Nihilus, the vast region of space cut off from Terra by the Great Rift, has become a laboratory for Nurgle's expansion as isolated imperial worlds struggle to maintain their defenses without external support. The breakdown of interstellar communication has prevented the coordination of anti-plague measures across multiple systems, allowing diseases to spread unchecked through entire sectors before local authorities recognize the scope of the threat. The psychological impact of isolation has created despair that makes populations vulnerable to cult recruitment, while the absence of inquisitorial oversight has allowed heretical organizations to operate openly in many regions. The Forge worlds within the Imperium Nihilus have experienced systematic corruption of their technological systems, as Nurgle's influence has learned to affect machine spirits and artificial intelligences. The introduction of data viruses that can spread through cogitator networks has created cascading failures in manufacturing and defense systems, while the corruption of blessed oils and sacred unguents has eliminated the spiritual protections that normally shield Imperial technology from chaos influence. The breakdown of these technological systems has created industrial accidents and equipment failures that generate the casualties and environmental contamination that feed Nurgle's power. The Space Marine chapters operating within the Imperium Nihilus have faced unprecedented challenges as they struggle to maintain their genetic purity and combat effectiveness without access to the specialized medical facilities and gene seed stocks maintained on Terra. The isolation has forced these chapters to rely on local resources and captured equipment that may be contaminated with Nurgle's influence, creating opportunities for corruption to infiltrate even the most disciplined and well-trained forces. The psychological stress of operating without support from the broader Imperium has created conditions that make Space Marines vulnerable to the despair that serves as a gateway to Nurgle's corruption. The predictions for Nurgle's future expansion suggest that the current period of growth will continue for several more centuries before reaching a peak that will fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the galaxy. The environmental and social conditions created by the Great Rift's opening have provided the Plague Father with opportunities that may not recur for millennia, making this a critical period for establishing permanent footholds in regions that had previously resisted his influence. The systematic corruption of Imperial infrastructure and the establishment of self-sustaining plague cult networks suggest that Nurgle's gains during this period will prove difficult to reverse even if Imperial forces eventually regain the initiative. The long-term implications of Nurgle's expansion extend beyond immediate military concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the survival of human civilization in its current form. The gradual corruption of Imperial worlds and the establishment of permanent zones of contamination suggest that large regions of the galaxy may become uninhabitable for normal human populations, forcing the Imperium to adapt its territorial strategies and population policies. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of disease and corruption may fundamentally alter Imperial culture, creating social conditions that favor acceptance of Nurgle's philosophy even among populations that have not been directly infected. The technological implications of Nurgle's expansion include the potential corruption of the standard template construct systems that provide the foundation for Imperial manufacturing capabilities. The introduction of diseases that can affect machine spirits and data storage systems threatens to compromise the technological knowledge that enables Imperial civilization to function, potentially forcing humanity back to more primitive technological levels. The corruption of gene seed stocks and other biological resources essential for maintaining Space Marine chapters could eliminate the Imperium's most effective military forces, leaving human worlds defenseless against external threats. The strategic responses available to the Imperium for countering Nurgle's expansion remain limited by the same resource constraints and coordination problems that have enabled the Plague Father's current success. The development of more effective medical countermeasures requires research facilities and personnel that are vulnerable to the very diseases they seek to combat, while the implementation of comprehensive quarantine measures demands resources that are needed for other critical military operations. The long-term nature of Nurgle's expansion means that effective countermeasures must be sustained over centuries or millennia, requiring levels of coordination and resource allocation that may exceed the Imperium's current capabilities. As the 41st millennium draws to its close, Nurgle's influence has become so deeply embedded in the fabric of imperial civilization that complete eradication may no longer be possible. The Plague Father's patient approach to corruption has created self-sustaining networks of infection and cult organization that can survive even major military defeats, while his philosophical message of acceptance has gained adherents among populations that have lost hope in the Imperium's ability to provide protection and prosperity. The grim darkness of the far future has become a reality in which Nurgle's gifts offer the only reliable relief from the suffering that characterizes existence in the 41st millennium, ensuring that the Plague Father's influence will continue to grow as long as mortals experience pain, disease, and despair. The galaxy stands at a crossroads where the ancient promise of human dominion over the stars has given way to a new reality in which survival itself has become humanity's greatest achievement. In this transformed cosmos, Nurgle's message of acceptance and community through shared suffering has gained a terrible relevance that makes his corruption not merely a threat to be defeated, but an inevitable consequence of the conditions that define existence in the grim darkness of the far future. The Plague Father's eternal patience ensures that he will continue to offer his gifts to those who suffer, and in a universe where suffering is the only constant, his influence can only grow stronger with each passing millennium.